Chapter number 18 of Perils in the Transvaal and Zululand. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rowan Puttergill. Perils in the Transvaal and Zululand by H.C. Adams. Chapter 18. Nearly a week had passed, and the cortege was again setting out from Heidelberg, where it had arrived 3 days previously. Lieutenant Evarts greeted his old companions in arms with much cordiality, and they travelled in great comfort as well as safety under his escort. He had expressed his great regret that he could not accompany them with his men to Lichtenberg. The distance between these two towns was much longer than between Lüneburg and Standerton, or between Standerton and Heidelberg. The country, too, was wilder and more sparsely inhabited. His presence, and that of half a dozen of his men, would have made everything smooth, but he was under orders to leave immediately for Newcastle as soon as he had performed his errand. All efforts to engage trustworthy men at Heidelberg had proved vain, and they were obliged to set out at last with the same party which had started from Lüneburg. It was with equal surprise and satisfaction that they overtook a few hours after leaving Heidelberg some soldiers belonging apparently to the Natal contingent, with a corporal at their head, who were escorting some prisoners, chiefly natives. These were handcuffed, as well as linked together by lashings round their arms. The soldiers were all white men. George, who was riding in advance of his party, moved up and spoke to the corporal. He introduced himself as Mr. Rivers, late of the mounted infantry, and stated that his companions had belonged to the same corps. The man answered civilly enough, though with a rather confused manner, that he remembered Lieutenant Rivers and his friends quite well, having been present at the action at Ulundi. George then inquired whither he was conveying his prisoners, and heard with much satisfaction that it was to Lichtenberg. It appeared that there had been a riot there. Houses had been plundered and murders committed, and these men, who were believed to have been concerned in the riot, had been arrested on the frontiers, and were on their way to Lichtenberg to be identified and tried. George again expressed his satisfaction, and proposed that the two parties should travel together for mutual convenience and security. To this the corporal rejoined that he should be quite satisfied with such an arrangement, and George rode off well pleased to give the information to Van der Heyden and Margetts, who were acting as rear guard. The Dutchman at once expressed his satisfaction, as did Margett, though in a more guarded manner, and George noticed with some surprise that he scrutinized very closely the corporal and his men when he rode up to speak to them. He made no remark, however, and George, riding back, resumed his place by Marget's side. It was still quite early. Desirous of avoiding the midday heat, which for the last day or two had been very great, they had started 2 hours before daybreak, and the whole landscape had hitherto been wrapped in a gloom through which they could not do much more than distinguish their way. But the dawn now began to dapple the skies, and with the first light appeared a scene so startling that our two travellers drew rein to gaze with wonder on it. As they had approached Heidelberg a few days previously, they had noticed how dull and uninteresting the landscape appeared. The ground had been rising continually for a long time past, until it had attained the height of some hundreds of feet, and then a long undulating level had succeeded, extending as far as the eye could reach, without rock or forest or scrub to break the monotony. Nor were there, for vast distances together, traces to be found of the hand of man. There were few enclosures or habitations, and even flocks of sheep were of rare occurrence. They had expected to find the country on the other side of Heidelberg very nearly the same in appearance as that which they had encountered before reaching it, but the landscape which they now beheld formed the most striking contrast to it. In place of the vast and barren plain, varied only by dried clumps of dull vegetation and bare heaps of sand or stone, there appeared a scene which might have vied with that of fairyland. Rich forests, with a most picturesque valley of outline, were seen environing the shores of a lake whose deep blue surface was studded with verdant islets. In the foreground rose castles and abbeys and picturesque ruins, grouped with a skill that no landscape painter could have surpassed, and the distant view was closed by mountain ridges presenting the most striking effects of light and shade. "Pretty to look at," remarked Mattimo, who had just ridden up as he noticed George's admiring gaze. "Pity it's not real." "Not real?" returned George. "What do you mean?" "You'll soon see," was the brief reply, and sure enough, almost immediately afterwards, the brilliant landscape melted away like a dissolving view in a magic lantern, and a long stretch of barren down and rock and scrub was all that could be discerned. "A mirage!" exclaimed George. "Well, I have often heard of them, but I could not have believed the delusion was so perfect." "Wonderful country for cheats of that sort," remarked Mattimo. "It often looks like that before sunrise." The midday halt was made under some high cliffs, which threw a long shadow and afforded some protection from the heat. Here Van der Heyden had some conversation with the corporal, and agreed with him that as his party could not proceed beyond a certain distance every day, all of them, except the corporal himself, being on foot, the soldiers should be allowed occasionally to change with the mounted men of Van der Heyden's party, while the prisoners were permitted to take their seats in the wagon. Margetts uttered a hasty exclamation when this arrangement was reported to him, but he said nothing more, and everything went on prosperously till the halt took place. They sat down in 3 parties, the corporal and his men by the side of the wagon, Mattimo, Haxo, and the Hottentots by the other, while the third, consisting of what might be termed the gentry of the party, took their places under some mimosas on the brink of a small fountain almost immediately under a high and steep rock. The meal was half over when suddenly there was heard a loud jabbering noise above, and the party looking up saw several hideous faces peering over the ridges of the rocks. "Bushmen!" exclaimed Reggie. "I have been expecting to fall in with them for some time. We are not so very far from their country, I believe. Hallo up there," he continued, as a number of large stones came rattling down from above. "Stop that, do you hear, or you'll find 2 can play at it." He raised his gun as he spoke and pointed it at the rocks. "It is no use laughing to them," observed Hardy, laughing. "I don't suppose they would understand you if they were bushmen, but they are not. They are baboons, mandrills, I believe, is their exact name. There are a great number of them in this part of the country. I wonder we haven't fallen in with them before." "Baboons, hey!" cried Reggie. "The mischievous brutes!" he added a minute or 2 afterwards, as another large stone passed over his head, which it very narrowly missed. "I say, I am not going to stand this sort of thing. I'll just give them a shot or 2 to improve their manners." "Stop, Mr. Margetts, don't fire!" cried Van der Heyden. "They're the most revengeful and malicious creatures in the world, and as strong and fierce as tigers. There are hundreds of them, and they'll attack us in a body if you provoke them." His warning came too late. Reggie had already fired, and a yell of pain from above announced that his aim had been successful. The next moment a dozen huge mandrills had sprung over the rocks and began to descend the cliffs, leaping from point to point as nimbly as squirrels. "Run for it!" shouted Hardy. "Take shelter in the wagons. We may keep them off there, but it is our only chance." There was no need of further warning. Mattimo, Haxo, and the Hottentots, the corporal, his men, and his prisoners, though they had been too far off to hear what was passing, no sooner saw the baboons coming down the rocks, screaming and gesticulating with fury, than they became aware of the danger of the situation, and made straight for the wagons as the only haven of shelter. Nor were they a moment too soon. The front and back boards of the wagons were only just secured when they were surrounded by a multitude of infuriated brutes, endeavouring to pull down the tilt and boards of the wagon. Others climbed onto the top and tore away the tarpaulin covering from the ribs, endeavouring to wrench out the ribs themselves with their strong, sharp claws. They became, however, in this manner an easy mark for the party inside. These at first only loaded their guns with powder, hoping to scare their assailants without further rousing their fury, but they were soon obliged to try sterner measures. The brutes, some of which were nearly 5 feet high and extremely strong and agile, succeeded in loosening more than one of the ribs of the wagon, and would soon have forced their way in if the bullets, which followed one another in rapid succession, had not laid assailant after assailant in the dust. But undeterred apparently by the deadly shower, they continued their attack, gibbering and screaming with fury. The whole of the covered wagon was now torn away, and the baboons, thrusting down their long sharp claws, endeavoured to clutch their enemies within, rendering it almost impossible for them to continue to load. "I say, George," exclaimed Reggie, as he rid himself with difficulty from a huge baboon which had seized him by the hair, firing his revolver directly into his chest, "these brutes are worse than the Zulus. I wish I had my bayonet here. That would have been the thing for them." "You're right, Reggie," answered George. "I'm just going to use my wood knife. My revolver is empty and I have no time to reload. The knife isn't as good as the bayonet, but it is the next best thing." The others followed his example, all excepting Hardy, who with the coolness of an old campaigner had lain himself down on the floor of the wagon, out of the reach of the assailants, and from thence took aim with his revolver, bringing down one baboon after another, and always singling out those which seemed to be the most likely to break in. But notwithstanding the vigorous resistance offered, it seemed as if the strong ribs of the roof must speedily give way, when suddenly there burst forth a volume of flame, which enveloped for a minute or two the whole wagon. Screaming, not with rage now, but with fright, the mandrels leaped down and rushed away, scrambling up the sides of the rocks more quickly than they had come down. At least 20 were left on the ground, either dead or too severely wounded to effect their retreat, while several others limped in the rear of their companions, scarcely able to accomplish the ascent. "Stop, Mr. Margetts," cried Hardy as he saw Reggie raise his rifle. "Don't fire at them. You may provoke them to come back." "Well, that was as near a thing as I remember to have seen. How did you manage it, Matumo?" "Kabu and Utango and I had been piling a big heap of reeds to make fires of," answered the Bechuana. "It was lucky we made the heap so large. When we saw Mr. Margetts fire at the baboons, we knew what would happen, and we heaped the reeds around the wagons while the brutes were coming down the rocks. I dropped a match among the reeds as soon as they began the attack, but for a long time it wouldn't catch. Lucky it did catch at last, or we should have been torn to pieces." "Well, you managed famously, Matumo," said Hardy, "and we all owe our lives to you." "Yes, sir, and your dinners too. Very good eating is baboon, and there is enough for a great many dinners." "Eating?" repeated Reggie in disgust. "You don't suppose any one would eat these brutes, do you?" "Well, Reggie, I agree with you. The idea isn't pleasant," said George, "but they can be eaten, I believe. An old messmate told me that when his ship was at Gibraltar many years before, the colonel of one of the regiments there sent Captain Waters the haunch of a large ape which had been shot a few days before. The captain didn't see the haunch, but invited all the officers of the ship to dine off it. The colonel, who had only intended a joke, sent a note explaining it, but somehow it wasn't delivered until just as the haunch was being removed from the table, having been declared to be excellent. The captain put the note into the fire and said nothing about the matter." "He was a wise man," said Hardy, "and we shall be wise to follow his example and make a good dinner off of our late enemies." His advice was at once followed. Fresh fuel was collected and fires lighted, and presently the cooks were busily engaged over their roasting and frying. "Come and take a look at the soldiers," suggested Margetts to Van der Heyden and Rivers. "I wonder how they came off in their wagon." "They were much luckier than we were," said Rivers. "Either the baboons didn't take any notice of their wagon, or they were bent, like Hardy's elephant, on punishing the culprit who fired on them. The soldiers were not attacked at all." "I'm very sorry, I'm sure," said Reggie. "I'll promise to be good another time, that is all I can say. But they made their preparations against attack, I suppose." "Yes," said Van Heyden. "They took off the prisoners' handcuffs, of course. They couldn't have left them in that helpless state to the mercy of those ferocious brutes. But I see they are going to put the handcuffs on again now." They moved nearer to the prisoners and stood for a while watching the replacing of the handcuffs. Then Rivers called out to Margetts, who was standing at a short distance, and asked him and Van der Heyden to ride a little way on the road by which they had come that morning to search for his revolver, which he must have dropped. The other two assented, and they went away together. About an hour and a half afterwards, when the dinners were nearly ready, Van der Heyden and Rivers returned, looking a good deal put out. "Corporal Sims," said the Dutchman, riding up to the person named, "this is vexatious, but I am afraid we must stay here tonight. Mr. Rivers cannot find his revolver, and thinks he must have dropped it a long way back, at the first stream which we crossed. Mr. Margetts has offered to ride back and look for it, and I am afraid we shall, in consequence, be obliged to remain here all night. As some repairs must be made to our wagon, perhaps it is not of so much consequence, but are you able to stay?" The corporal hesitated a moment, apparently a good deal surprised. Then he answered civilly that he saw no reason why they should not remain, as there was plenty of food and a good spring of water, and there was no particular need for haste. "Very well, then," said Van der Heyden, riding on. "We will stay here till tomorrow." Nothing was said until the two horsemen were out of hearing. Then one of the prisoners said in a guarded tone, "Do they suspect anything, do you think, Andreas?" "No," answered Andreas. "I'm pretty sure they do not. Why do you ask that, Bostock?" "I've been uneasy all day," was the answer, "lest either Rivers or Van der Heyden should recognize us. It is quite true that I am stained as dark as any Zulu in the country, and so are Gott and Sullivan, and our beards and whiskers have been shaved, and our hair frizzled and dyed back, so that we could hardly recognize ourselves in the glass. But they are both of them wide-awake fellows, and I shouldn't like this kind of thing to go on long. I suppose our intention holds good to make an attack tonight, doesn't it?" "I don't see why not," answered the pseudo-corporal. "It was agreed that we should all of us approach the wagon together as soon as the moon sets, and that will be before 12 o'clock. They keep a watch all night, I know. One of them stands sentinel at the fire near the wagon, but a rifle bullet will quiet him. Then we rush up and shoot the others. We shall have only 4 to deal with, instead of 5 now. The Hottentots are sure to run off at the first shot." "Margetts may return," remarked Gott. "If he does, he'll hardly reach the camp," returned Bostock. "Someone had better be on the lookout for him, a mile or so on the Heidelberg road. There will still be 12 of us left. That will be enough to settle 4 men, won't it, even if they should not be asleep?" "You forget the woman," the corporal said with a smirk. "No, I don't forget them, Andreas," answered Bostock angrily. "But you had better do so. Forget Miss Van der Heyden at all events. You will remember that she is to become my wife as soon as we can reach Durenburg, where the missionary has promised to marry us. You had better all keep that in your heads, or you may chance to find an ounce of lead there." "Well, you needn't be so cranky about it, John Bostock," said Sullivan. "Will Andreas and the others have been your pals ever since we came into the country nigh upon 12 months ago, and Jem Gott and I was your pals long before, and we've never done anything but please you, and we ain't going to now." "Well, that's as it should be, Sullivan, and we need have no more words about that. Now dinner's ready, I see, so we'd better fall to that." Meanwhile, Van der Heyden and his 2 friends had no sooner completed their meal than they hastened to the wagon and summoned Mattimo and Haxo to assist them in repairing the damage sustained. Their first step was to renew the canvas covering, which had been torn down. Then they nailed thick boards all round the lower part of the wagon and constructed a kind of citadel in the middle, consisting of 4 strong boxes about 3 feet high, inside which 2 persons might take refuge. "I wish you would not think so much of me," urged Anchen, from whom it had been impossible to conceal the approaching danger. "My life is of no more value than any one of yours, and you are neglecting, I am sure, your own safety. Henrik, will you not listen to me? Mr. Rivers, will not you?" She blushed deeply as she spoke. "Say no more, Anchen," returned her brother sternly, though with evident tenderness of feeling. "We shall do our best, for ourselves as well as for you, and there is every hope that Margetts will return before these scoundrels even begin their attack. It cannot be more than a 2 hours' ride to Heidelberg. I could do it myself in a little more than 1, but then unfortunately I was only on terms of distant civility with Lieutenant Evetts." "It'll take Margetts at least 2 hours," observed Hardy, "and then there may be difficulty in finding Mr. Evetts and in getting his men together. It was 3 o'clock when Margetts rode off. If he is back by 10, it is as early as can reasonably be hoped." 10 will be enough time, remarked Rivers. "They will wait for the moon to set, or they would be an easy mark for our bullets." "And the moon does not set till 11, said Van der Heyden. "Besides, even if they do make their attack, it remains to be seen whether we cannot keep them off. It can hardly be worse than it was at Rorke's Drift, when we three stood side by side together. But I think we have now been as long at work in the wagon as it is safe for us to be. We might awaken suspicion if it was thought that we were fortifying it. We must get out, and not return to it until after the moon is set. Anshin, I shall wish you good-bye now. You must be in your place of shelter when we return." He folded her in a warm embrace, and then leaped from the wagon, forgetting that George still remained, or unwilling perhaps, to witness his adieu. George took her hand and looked earnestly into her face. "This may be the last time we shall meet," he said. "I know I can never have my wish, but I should like you to know how fondly I love you." The tears rose in her eyes and streamed down her face. "I do know it," she murmured. "I do know it, George. I prize and I return it." Their lips met for a moment as if by a mutual impulse, and then Rivers leaped down and joined his companions, who had taken their places by the fire. The night came on clear and bright, as is the night of those regions. The moon a dazzling globe of crystal, the stars studding the sky with brilliant specks of light. The three friends affected to converse carelessly together, intermingling their talk with bursts of merriment, but every ear was in reality strained to catch the distant tramp of horses' feet, the more keenly because the hour had now indeed come when Margette's return was not only possible, but might be reasonably looked for. Anxiously they watched the moon as it sank slowly down in the heaven, disappearing at last behind the distant mountain range, and comparative darkness succeeded, which under the shadow of the cliffs rendered objects, even at a little distance, scarcely distinguishable. Then they rose, and somewhat noisily bade the Hottentots good night, desiring them to keep a careful watch. Moving off to their own wagon, they crept stealthily behind and round under its cover to the other, which was reserved for Anshin and her attendants, and got inside, joining Matamo and Haxo, who were anxiously expecting them. They had lighted a lantern, whose light just showed the interior of the wagon. "Hark! What was that?" exclaimed Hardy, as a sound resembling that of the discharge of a gun was heard at some distance. "Can that be Margette's signal?" "It is most unlikely that he would discharge his gun," said Rivers. "It would have the effect of putting these ruffians on their guard. He knows that we have no need to be warned." "True," said Hardy, "but if he is coming at all, it ought to be soon. It is nearly 11:30. These fellows will make their attack almost immediately now. Ha! Listen. Yes, I hear them coming." Even as he spoke, a hand was laid on the shutter by which the back of the cart was closed, and an attempt made to pull it open. Van der Heyden put his head out. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "This is my sister's sleeping place." "I know that, Mr. Van der Heyden, and I know you, and you too know me. I am Langley Cargill of the Nassau Regiment, your equal by birth and station. I design your sister no harm, but to make her my wife. Give her up to me, and I will ensure her safety and the most honourable treatment." "I would as soon give her into the hands of Satan," cried Van der Heyden fiercely. "You and your ruffians will do wisely to move off at once, or we will fire on you without mercy." "Then take the consequences of your own folly. Fire into the wagon, boys," he shouted. "We'll soon make an end of this." A dozen guns were discharged, and the leaden hail came rattling between the ribs of the tilt above them. It did not produce much effect, as all those within had thrown themselves on the floor, where the solid sides of the wagon, strengthened by the recent defences, prevented the bullets from penetrating. The next moment the fire was returned with more effect. 2 of the pretended soldiers were shot dead on the spot. Bostock and one of his men were severely wounded. "Rush up and smash the shutters before they can load again," shouted Bostock, regardless of his wound. He caught up a heavy piece of timber which shattered the stout boards at a blow, and was about to mount the attack, followed by his comrades, when a volley of musketry was suddenly poured in, which stretched 2 or 3 or more of the banditti on the ground, and a voice was heard calling them to surrender, or no quarter would be shown. Van der Heyden and his companions leaped from the wagon to shake hands with Margetts and Evetts, who, with a dozen of his men, had now completely surrounded the robbers, nearly all of whom, indeed, were either killed or wounded. But the danger was not entirely at an end, as they had supposed. Bostock had been pierced by a second bullet, and it was plain that he had received his death wound, but his fierce spirit still bore him up. He heard Evetts challenge with a scornful laugh. "Surrender," he cried. "Not I, at all events. I believe I am done for this time, but there is still some fighting left in me. Hendrik van der Heyden, I told you I should one day return your fire. There is time to do so yet." He raised himself with some difficulty, and levelling his revolver, fired at his antagonist, who was only a few feet from him. With fell satisfaction, he noted that the shot had taken effect. Then he fell back and expired without a groan. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of Perils in the Transvaal and Zululand. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anushka. Perils in the Transvaal and Zululand by H.C. Adams. Chapter 19. "Are you much hurt?" cried Rivers, rushing up to Van der Heyden and raising him, while Hardy supported him on the other side. "I don't know. I hardly felt it," he answered. "I don't think it struck the ribs." "We must get his coat off and stop the bleeding," said Hardy. "If you will hold him, I will unfasten the coat. Bring the lantern closer." "Leave him to me, sir," said a voice behind. "I know something of surgery, as a man has need to do who lives in the country." Both Rivers and Hardy turned round in great surprise. The speaker was Mr. Prescott. "Ah, you wondered to see me here. I had no intention of leaving home when we parted, but I was summoned to Heidelberg 2 days afterwards, and was on my way to Mr. Evetts when Mr. Margetts met me. We must cut the coat away. If the wound is where I suspect, it would give him great pain to take it off his shoulders." "Ah, I thought so," he continued when the sleeve had been cut away and the shoulder had been laid bare. "You have had a narrow escape, sir. The bullet struck the cartridge belt, which was hanging round your neck, and glanced off, passing out through the fleshy part under the armpit, just missing the rib. But it is a nasty wound, too. You will have to lie quite quiet for some time, and be careful that the bleeding does not burst out again. There must be some proper person to nurse him." "His sister, Miss Van der Heyden, is here, sir," said Rivers. "She is the wagon yonder. She does not know anything about this yet." "You had better go and warn her," said Mr. Prescott. "Then we will carry him to the wagon." His instructions were obeyed. Anton was of course terribly distressed, but repressed her emotion and instantly set about the necessary preparations. The boxes were removed from the wagon, and as soft a bed as possible made upon the floor of dried grass and reeds, over which several rugs were laid. The wagon fortunately stood in a sheltered place under 2 large trees, whither it had been moved to render it as secure from attack as possible. Anton and Rose undertook the nursing, and Mr. Prescott engaged to send over the necessary medicines from Heidelberg. "He must be kept as quiet as possible, remember. I suppose there are enough here," glancing round as he spoke at the Hottentot servants, as well as the Matamor and Haxo, "to secure him against disturbance or attack." "There will be no further fear of attack," said George, to whom this remark appeared to be addressed. "This wretched Bostock is dead, and all the rest of the gang have either been killed or are prisoners. Stay, though," he added. "I see Gott is prisoner, and Van Ryck was hanged at Rorke's Drift, but I am afraid Sullivan has escaped." "It will be a pity if he has," remarked Lieutenant Evetts. I hear at Heidelberg that the whole gang has been for months past the best of the neighborhood. Sullivan has not escaped, said Margetts. I can account for him. He had been set to watch for me as I returned to the camp, and pick me off, I suppose. But he fell into his own trap. Ha, that must have been the shot, then, that we heard, said Rivers. What made you so long in returning, Reggie? We were getting alarmed. Well, I missed the track, said Margetts, and had ridden past Heidelberg. By good luck, I met Mr. Prescott, who was riding in to see Mr. Evans, and he took me with him. It was after all no loss of time, I believe, for he knew where to find Evans, which I did not. And during our ride to Heidelberg, he told me something, George, which you will be interested to hear. But first, I will tell you about Sullivan. Evans got his men together, and Mr. Prescott volunteered to come with us, wanting to identify some of the gang, who had more than once stolen his property. When we got within a mile or two, Evans scattered his men and told them to move up with as little noise as possible. One of them in this manner got past Sullivan without being seen by him. He chanced to look back and saw Sullivan just leveling his gun at me, and he anticipated the shot by sending a bullet through the back of his skull. He was lying dead by the roadside when I passed, and I recognized him as Sullivan, notwithstanding his disguise. Talking of his disguise, observed Rivers, I wonder where they got the soldiers' uniforms from. I know there are fellows among them who are clever enough at staining Europeans so as to look like natives. But how did they come by the uniforms? That is a question easily enough answered, remarked Lieutenant Evans, who had now joined the party. The Zulus stripped soldiers enough at Isandlwana to fit out a regiment or two, and for months afterwards they were to be had for anything the Zulus could get for them. But I must say the get-up on the whole was not bad. No, assented Harry, and the fellows who wore the uniforms had all, I fancy, been really in the army at one time or another. Certainly the corporal had. Yes, said Rivers. When I first spoke with the man, I thought I knew his face, and probably I had seen him in the ranks. That was one of the circumstances that for a long time prevented me from entertaining any suspicion. By the by, George, said Margetts, I have forgotten to ask you how you discovered Bostock. I thought, as I told you, there was something strange about the party, but did not suspect Bostock was among them. And his disguise was so perfect that I can hardly believe he is the fellow lying dead yonder. There was no time to ask you when you sent me off to Heidelberg, but I should like to ask how you recognized him. It was your remark and his limp that first made me suspect him, said George. He has always limped since he received the wound on board the Zulu Queen. I happened to know he had received another wound a few months since, a bullet wound on the wrist. I went and stood close at hand while the pretended corporal was putting the handcuffs again on the prisoner's wrists, and there was the scar of the wound plain enough. I saw Bostock glance suspiciously at me as he saw I was scrutinizing his wrist, and I had some trouble to keep myself from showing that I had discovered him. But you were saying, Reggie, that Mr. Prescott had told you something which I should be interested to hear. May I ask you what it was? Well, Mr. Rivers, said Prescott, it was simply that I am well acquainted with your mother. In the course of my business, I make frequent journeys to Zeerast and know old Ludwig Manson and his family quite well. I was there not many weeks ago. It is odd that his name did not come up in the course of our conversation about Zeerast. I did not particularly notice yours, or it would have certainly done so. You wrote to her some time ago, did you not? Yes, said George, 8 or 9 months ago, but I have never received any reply to my letter. Ah, I suppose so. The man to whom you gave it was several months in getting to Umtongo, which was the name of the Manson's farm. Then she could get no messenger to carry a reply for several weeks, and must have reached Rorke's Drift somewhere about the beginning of June. But it appeared you had left the Natal Volunteers, and was thought you were going to join some other corps. But that was not known for certain. She is in a terrible state of alarm now, that you have been killed at Kinghaylovo or Ulundi or one of the smaller battles. Well, her anxiety will soon be relieved now, observed Margetts. I trust so, but in that case Mr. Rivers must not wait to accompany Mr. Van der Heeden to Zeerust. Mr. Van der Heeden cannot be moved for 3 weeks, and then he must travel very slowly. I do not suppose he can get back to his destination under a month at the very earliest. Of course, I shall not wait for that, said Rivers. I shall ride across country, if I can find a guide. I suppose it will not occupy very long, Mr. Prescott. No, sir. Your horse, if that is your horse yonder, would take you there in 4 days, probably in 3, but certainly in 4. And as for a guide, interposed Hardy, you will not find a better in all the Transvaal than Matamo. He knows the whole of this country as well as I know the path about my own farm. I am sorry that I myself cannot remain here. I have another engagement to fulfill at Newcastle, but I will undertake to return before Mr. Van der Heeden can reach Zeerust. Meanwhile, Mr. Margetts will stay here and look after the party. Must that be so? Asked George. I should have liked Reggie to accompany me. It must be, I am afraid, said Hardy. I am sorry that my engagement must be kept. I am sorry too, said Margetts. But of course we cannot leave Van der Heeden here alone. When shall you set out, George? Tomorrow, if Matamo is prepared, was the answer. But we must lie down now and take some rest. The dawn must be close at hand. I shall return with my party and the prisoners at once, said Lieutenant Evetts, and I suppose you, also, Mr. Prescott, will accompany me. Yes, said Mr. Prescott. The medicines and lint ought to be set out at once. They parted, and our travellers, lying down, took some hours' repose. Then George summoned Matamo and inquired of him whether he knew the way to Umtongo and would undertake to guide him thither. The way to Umtongo, repeated Matamo. I know it quite well. I've been there 2-3 times. I could ride it in the dark. That's all right, then, said George. Yes, sir. We can get there in 3 days. Kudu's Vley 1 day, Malapos Kolof 2 days, Umtongo 3 days. But they will be long days. Then had we not better start at once? Yes, sir, or we shall not reach Kudu's Vley tonight. And I will go and get everything ready. In 2 hours they set off, the Bichuana appearing to be in high spirits. The track he pursued led through a country wilder than any George had yet seen. It ran for some miles along the banks of a small but more picturesque stream, the banks of which were clothed with trees of every variety. The mimosa predominated, but it was intermingled with date trees and Kaffir plums and huge cacti, with their sword-like leaves and acais already coming into flower. Overhead hoopoes and parrots kept up a never-ending chorus, while countless tribes of monkeys and squirrels leaped and chattered among the branches. Occasionally there sprang up, with the whirring noise so familiar to the sportsman, a covey of red-brown partridges. Notwithstanding that they were well supplied with provisions, George's instinct could not forego the opportunity. He let fly right and left with both barrels. 2 partridges dropped dead just in front of them, while others flew off wounded. Matamo dismounted and secured them, and they proved a most appetizing addition to their supper when they halted a few hours after. How far are we from Kudu's Vley? Said Rivers, as he leaned back against the sloping bank after having made a delicious meal. Kudu's Vley? About 3 hours' ride. Give the horses a long rest, and we shall get there before the moon goes down. George relapsed into thought. The excitement of the last few hours had left no time for reflection, but now the recollection of what had passed between himself and Ancient came vividly back. He had long felt assured that notwithstanding the distance at which he had always been kept from her, she was not indifferent to him, but now he had had a distinct assurance to that effect from her lips. For a moment the doubt crossed him whether, in the few hurried words he spoke to her before the attack, he had not in some measure broken his promise to Van der Heeden. There had been little time for reflection, and his had been dictated by a sudden impulse. But no. He felt sure it had not been so. His promise to Van der Heiden had been that he would not ask her to be his wife, and he had not asked her. Doubtless she would expect him to follow up his declaration by a formal offer, but it must rest with her brother whether that must be made. On the whole, he had good hope, when he recalled the particulars of Van der Heiden's interview with him, that he would withdraw his opposition. At all events, there was no need to be downhearted about it, and perhaps the less his thoughts rested upon it, the better. He turned to Matamor, who was sitting on the other side of the fire, sorely disturbed, apparently, at the long silence to which George's reverie had consigned him. He responded at once to George's advances, who inquired of him whether he had known Mr. Prescott before he met him a few days previously. "Do I know Mr. Prescott?" "Yes, sir. I have known him a long time. Very good, boss, is Mr. Prescott. He tells pretty stories." "More pretty than true, eh, Matamor?" suggested George. "Did you hear his story about the lion and the powder flask?" "Yes, sir. I've heard that more than once. It gets nicer every time it is told. Mr. Hardy, too, he tells a nice story about the cobra in the tree, but not so nice as my story about the big boa." "Your story, an adventure of your own, like the leap of the hippopotamus's head, eh? Let us hear it by all means, Matamor." "Yes, sir. It had happened a great many years ago. I had been sent on an errand to the Castle Mountains. A fat old Dutchman seized me, and would not believe my story, but made a slave of me. If I said a word, he tied me up to the cart wheel and flogged me with the jambok. One day he sent me after an ox that had strayed. He was always afraid that I should run away, and if I was any time out, came to meet me with the jambok ready in his hand. I couldn't find the ox anywhere, but I thought I saw something moving in a thick bush, and I fancied it might be the stray beast. I forced myself away inside, and trod on what I thought was the end of a log. But it was a great boa, not a log. The boa put up its head and was going to spring, but I ran like a springbok, and the boa after me. I never went so fast in my life, but the boa went faster. Just on the edge of the wood, I saw the fat Dutchman coming with the whip. When the Dutchman saw the boa, he too turned and ran. But I ran faster than the Dutchman anyhow. The boa thought he was better eating than a lean Bechuana boy, and he caught him round the waist and twisted himself all about him. The Dutchman was so big that the boa went only twice round him. He bellowed for help so loud that everyone could hear him, so there was no need for me to tell them. "What did you do then, Matamor?" "I ran away as fast as I could, and went home to Mr. Balin." "I suppose the Dutchman was killed, wasn't he?" "Yes, sir, the big snake ground him up like corn in a mill, jambok and all," added Matamor significantly. "Well, you must tell that story to Mr. Prescott and Mr. Hardy. I don't think either of them could beat it." "Ah, but I had another escape from a rhinoceros, closer than that," said the Bechuana, evidently much gratified at George's approval. "Closer than that," said George. "Must have been a near one then, indeed. Let us hear it by all means." "It was in the rocky country above Standerton," said Matamor. "I was hunting and had to climb some steep crags 200 or 300 feet high, and in some places as steep as a wall. I got to the top and sat down to rest under a small tree that grew close to the edge of the precipice. Presently I got up and went on to the wood, where there were plenty of elands and antelopes. All of a moment a big female rhinoceros broke out and ran at me. I put up my gun and hit her just in the right place, and she dropped. I was going to load again when I saw close behind her the male rhinoceros, and he made a rush at me. There was no time to load. I threw my gun away and ran for it as hard as I could. But the precipice was right in front, and no room to turn to the right or the left. The rhinoceros is very swift of foot. He was close behind me as I approached the edge. I thought we should both go over together, but just at the last moment I seized the bole of the tree and swung myself round. The rhinoceros couldn't catch hold of the tree and couldn't stop himself. Over he went in a moment, and I heard him strike the ground 300 feet down. I went below and took a look at him. He was smashed to atoms. That was a close shave too, said George. But come, Mattimo, it is time we were off again. The horses must be fully rested. They remounted and proceeded for several hours, but for some reason they did not make good progress. The horse ridden by the Bechuana appeared to be completely tired out and could with difficulty be urged to an easy trot. The moon had set while they were still fully 3 miles from Kudu's Lake, and Mattimo declared it would not be safe to proceed further that night. He off-saddled his horse with more care than usual, and instead of knee-haltering and turning him out to graze as usual, secured him by a headstall under the shelter of some trees, and brought him some grass and water. But the animal, though it drank thirstily, seemed unable to eat, and presently lay down too much exhausted, apparently, by its day's journey to stand. "Bad job this, Mr. Rivers," said Mattimo, after carefully noting the horse's condition. "What do you think is the matter with him?" inquired Rivers. "The horse sickness, sir. I've been afraid of it for an hour or two, but there is no doubt of it now. It is less common at this time of the year, but it happens sometimes." "Can't anything be done?" asked George. "I know this horse sickness is a strange malady which no one seems to understand, but is there really no cure for it?" "None that I've ever heard of," was the answer. "Yes, he's getting worse. He'll die. Nothing can cure him." "Has he been bitten by the testis, do you think?" asked George. "The testis? No, sir. The testis is not found here. There is no mistake about it whether it is found. I know it well, and its buzz too. It is certain to kill any horse it attacks, or ox either." "Does it hurt a man then?" inquired George. "It never bites man, or a donkey, or a mule. But what this poor brute has is the horse sickness, and nobody knows either the cause or the cure of that." After an hour or two afterwards, Mattimo's predictions were verified. As the darkness came on, the poor brute's malady got worse. Its flanks heaved, it drew its breath with ever-increasing difficulty. Its tongue lolled from the jaws which were tightly clenched on it. Then violent convulsions came on, and it expired. "What is to be done now, Mattimo? Can you go on with me? Can you go on with me on foot?" asked George. "We could ride alternately, you know. Of course we should not go nearly as fast, but we should get there in time." "I'm very sorry, Mr. Rivers, but I can't go. Mr. Balin wants me back. I must have returned to Horner's Kraal the very day after the party reached Lichtenberg." George remembered that Mr. Balin, while they were at Colenso, had told him that the time of the year when he could never spare Mattimo was the spring. At the time when he made George the offer of the Bechuana's services, there had been no idea of the journey to Zeras being delayed so long. He felt, therefore, that he ought not to urge Mattimo to remain longer with him. But, on the other hand, if he returned to Heidelberg with Mattimo and obtained another guide, at least a week would be lost. Knowing his mother's anxiety and distress, he was most unwilling to protract them. Besides, he could remain only a certain time at Umtongo, and he could not cut that any shorter, if he could help it. "Do you think I would find my way by myself, Mattimo, if you gave me full directions?" he asked. "I am not able to say that, sir. I will tell you the way as well as I can, but if you go on to Kudu's Lake, you will find the Kafir's kraal, which is close to it, and they will show you the way to the Manson's farm, if you pay them money. The Kafirs will go anywhere for money, and they know the place well." With this, George was obliged to be contented, and having obtained the most minute directions as regarded the road to Kudu's Lake, which lay only 2 miles off, he said good-bye to the Bechuana on the following morning and rode off alone. There was no difficulty in finding his way, Mattimo's directions having been very clear and the landmarks easy to find. He proceeded, however, cautiously, and about 2 hours reached the valley, which he clearly enough recognized, as well as the Gaffer kraal standing as Martimer had described it, on the banks of a small stream and in an open glade surrounded by wood. But to his great disappointment it was wrecked and deserted. Either there had been a quarrel with some hostile tribe, or a Dutch commando had been sent against it. But whichever may have been the case, all its inhabitants were gone. George searched all round, but could nowhere find one single Kaffir. He was now greatly troubled. Relying on Martimer's assurance of meeting with the guide, he had not even taken any instructions from him as to the way to his mother's house. He only knew in a general way that it had to lay to the northwest. He would at once have ridden back and endeavoured to overtake Martimer, but he reflected that the Bechuana, being now on foot, would probably take a shorter way to Heidelberg, which he had been unable to follow while on horseback. There was only, in fact, the alternative of going on, in what he knew must be at least the right direction, or return to the town. After a long debate, he determined on the former course. He took out his pocket compass and turned his horse's head directly to the north. He rode on for 7 or 8 hours, and presently the aspect of the country changed. An open stretch of veldt succeeded to the mingled forest and scrub and jungle through which he had been passing. The grass grew up to his horse's hocks, and in some places up to its shoulder. Suddenly there came a rush through the grass, and a hearty beast, closely pursued by a pack of wild dogs, rushed by him. George had not hitherto come much into contact with these creatures, which, however, are to be found in large numbers in these regions. They are curious animals, more resembling hyenas than dogs, though the specially distinctive mark of the hyena, the drooping off at the hindquarters, is not to be found in them, but in the stripe and the bushy tail and the peculiar shaped ear they closely resemble the hyena. They are not so cowardly as the last named creatures, and are in consequence more dangerous to encounter. The hartebeest was evidently almost exhausted. It was not likely that it could run another mile, and George, who had omitted to take any provision with him, expecting to get his dinner at the Kaffir kraal, resolved to follow and rescue the carcass from the wild dogs, whom a shot from his rifle would probably disperse, or at all events keep at a distance while he cut off the meat he required. He spurred his horse accordingly and started in pursuit, but the ground was soft, and for some time he gained but little on his quarry. The hartebeest held on with more vigour than he had expected, and at last, when he had gotten within distance, a sudden stumble of his horse caused him altogether to miss his mark. He was obliged to stop and reload, and the ground thus lost was difficult to regain. It was not until after a full hour's pursuit that he saw the hartebeest, unable to go any further, at last turn round in despair and face his enemies. Rivers had now sufficient time to take aim at the leader of the pack, with his first barrel, and the hartebeest with the second. Both shots were successful. The hartebeest dropped instantly with a ball through its heart, and the dog rushed off with a yell of pain, falling dead before it had gone 100 yards. But the rest of the troop did not take to flight, as George had expected. Probably the pursuit of the prey had been stimulated by hunger, which now rendered them insensible to danger. After a moment's hesitation, they rushed on the carcass, while one or two, bolder than the rest, sprang on his horse, from which he had alighted to drive off the dogs with his hunting knife. Terrified at the attack, the steed broke loose from George's hold, galloping off at full speed, and pursued by the greater part of the pack. George shouted and endeavoured to follow, but became instantly aware of the hopelessness of the attempt. The horse was already 100 yards off, galloping at the utmost of his speed, in the hope of distancing its pursuers. The darkness, too, was rapidly coming on. It would plainly be impossible for him to recover his horse that night, as it would presently be too dark to discern any objects at a distance. He must provide himself, as well as he was able with food and shelter for the night. Hastily reloading, he first rid himself of the 2 or 3 dogs that were busily engaged in mangling the body of the hartebeest. Next, with his hunting knife, he cut down a quantity of bushes, part of which he piled up as a shelter against the wind, which began to blow with some sharpness as the dusk came on. The rest of the wood he set alight by the help of the matches in his belt, and presently succeeded in kindling a tolerable fire. Then he cut off some meat from the carcass of the hartebeest, of which there was a good deal left, notwithstanding the ravages of the dogs. By these means, and by obtaining water from a clear rivulet, which he found flowing at a little distance, he contrived to satisfy his hunger and thirst. He sat down in the shelter which he had provided for himself, and looked up at the sky above him. It was a delicious night. The constellations of the southern hemisphere are not in themselves as beautiful as those with which we of the northern regions are familiar, but their liquid brilliancy, seen against the background of the deepest blue, renders the general aspect of the heavens far more lovely and imposing. The sense also of entire loneliness came upon him with profound solemnity. He was here far, he knew not how far, from all human help and sympathy. Whatever good or evil fortune might befall him was his concern and his only. The utter helplessness of man so situated impressed him painfully. We seldom realize the full meaning of passages of Holy Writ until some striking circumstance of our lives bring them home to us. And George felt for the first time how profound a meaning was contained in these words. It is not good for man to be alone. End of chapter 19. Recording by Anushka. Chapter 20 of Perils in the Transvaal and Zululand. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anushka. Perils in the Transvaal and Zululand by H.C. Adams. Chapter 20. George awoke chilled and cramped with the night air, and was preparing leisurely to get up and commence the search after his missing steed, when his eye lit on an object a few feet of him, which caused him instantly to leap to his feet. A snake, which had probably been attracted to the same spot during the night by the warmth of the fire, was just raising its head, as if preparing to dart upon him, spitting venom at the same time from its open jaws. His rapid backward spring just enabled him to avoid its fangs, but some of the poison had been spurted onto his face, and he instantly felt a sharp sting of pain. His first act was to crush the head of the reptile with his heel, and then to sever its neck with his knife. It was of a dark brown, almost a black color, and 6 or 7 feet long. George had never seen one of the kind before, but recognized it from the descriptions that had been given him as the picahloo, the most venomous, it was said, of any known serpent, and called by the natives the spitting snake. George noticed that the fangs were still distilling poison in a considerable quantity, notwithstanding that the neck had been completely severed. He felt a good deal of pain in the places where the poison had fallen, and especially in the white of the left eye. He hurried to the spring, which was fortunately only at a short distance, and kneeling down, plunged his head again and again into the water, hoping in that manner to get rid of the painful smart. This gave him some slight relief, and he hoped that, as no poison could have mixed with his blood, the pain would gradually wear itself out. The first thing, of course, was to find his horse. He had hoped that if it had succeeded in shaking off the wild dogs, it would return to the spring to drink. But though he did not doubt that it would soon outstrip them, they having been evidently completely exhausted by the long previous chase, there might be water nearer to the point at which the animal found itself after its escape, and in that case, of course, it would make for it. Taking up his gun, he began following the track of the animal's hooves, which were clear enough to be traced in the soft grass of the veldt. After an hour's search, the grass was exchanged for a long, arid stretch of sand, diversified by scrub and stone. Here the hoofs of the horse and the lighter prints of the dog's feet were still more plainly to be distinguished. The sand became looser and looser as he advanced. It was evident that the horse must have grown rapidly more exhausted, and its feet plunged almost to the fetlock at every step. At last he came upon the carcass of the animal itself, which had evidently been torn down by the pack and devoured. There had plainly been a furious struggle, one or two dogs having been killed by the dying efforts of the horse. Rivers was now seriously alarmed. He must retrace his steps as well as he was able to the spring, and seek again to relieve the burning pains in his face, which was under the scorching heat of the sun stung him more sharply than even at first. Then he must make his way on foot, keeping as before to the northwest, and hope to fall in with some traveller, or reach the shelter of some friendly habitation. He was well aware that if all these chances failed him, his life on earth would soon be ended. He began his return across the sandy waste, and, after several hours of painful exertion, succeeded in reaching the spring, by the side of which he sank down, completely exhausted. Long and copious draughts somewhat restored him, and as the cool of the evening came on, he got up and resumed his journey, making another meal before he started on what remained of his morning's repast. He walked on for a mile or two, leaning on his gun, and hardly sensible of the objects around him. At last he got to a part of the wood where the trees seemed to have been cut away, and a broader path, almost approaching to a road, cut out. He staggered for some distance along this track, and then his senses completely deserted him, and he dropped to the ground, his gun going off as he fell, though happily without injury to himself. When he opened his eyes again, he looked around him with great surprise. He was lying on a comfortable bed in a tolerable sized room, which, though different in many respects from any chamber he had hitherto occupied, was nevertheless evidently of European construction. There was a sash window looking out, so far as George could distinguish, upon a garden. The walls were of plank, planed and fitted together with some neatness, the floor of mud beaten hard and smeared with cow dung. There were no tables or chairs, no chests of drawers or washing apparatus, but there was a bench and one or two solid chests. The bed itself was tolerably clean, and there were sheets but of coarse material. By his side, on a shelf, were a teacup and spoon and several bottles. With some difficulty he recalled the incidents which had taken previously to his fainting fit, the poison spurted on his face by the snake, his search after his horse, and his subsequent journey through the wood. But all seemed dim and confused, as if it had taken place a long while ago. He lay thinking for a long time, or rather in a state of half-consciousness, in which dream and reality were blended together. Then he closed his eyes and again fell asleep, waking up a second time, also to his confused fancy after a long period of inaction. He found himself lying on the same bed and in the same room, but this time he was not alone. There was an old man sitting by his bedside and watching him apparently with some curiosity. He was a Dutchman, that was plain from his physiognomy alike and his dress, and probably a man of some substance. His clothes were of the usual material, but of a good quality, and had not been much worn. His features were rather harsh, but not repulsive, and his demeanour quiet and self-possessed. He noticed the change in George's appearance and proceeded to express his satisfaction in English, which was not quite idiomatic, but nevertheless was intelligible. The Englishman is better. Is he able to talk? Thank you. I feel much better, said George. Will you please to tell me where I am and how I came here? I heard your gun and found you in a swoon. This is my house. It's called Mellowclose Kloof. I'm very thankful, said George. How long have I been ill? It is more than 5 weeks since I found you. 5 weeks last Monday. 5 weeks, repeated George, becoming dimly conscious of strange, wild scenes among which he had seemed to have passed an immeasurable period of time. Gallops over interminable plains, struggles with armed assassins, writhings of wounded snakes, and like the phantasmagoria of a sick fancy succeeding and intermingling with one another. 5 weeks! Have I had a fever? A marsh fever, and a very bad one. I thought several times the Englishman would die, said the old man. And who has been my doctor? Inquired Rivers, only able to recall two figures that were quite shadowy and real. The figure of the man before him, and another younger than he. Who have been my doctor and my nurse? You have had no doctor. There is none in these parts. Rudolph and I nursed you, was the answer. We put on cool bandages and gave you cool drinks, nothing else. And I have to thank you for my life, then, exclaimed George, feebly stretching out his hand, and becoming aware for the first time how thin and wasted it had become. We could not let the Englishman die, said the old man simply. But you must be quiet. You are not strong enough to talk. Putting a glass containing some mixture which tasted deliciously cool and refreshing to his lips, the Dutchman now withdrew, and now Rivers was soon once more buried in slumber. He woke again after a long interval, feeling stronger, and so went on for a week or two more, gaining strength continually, until at last he was permitted to get up and sit for an hour in the garden, which is now in the prime of its beauty and luxuriance. Mynheer Kransberg, that he presently discovered to be his host's name, had been one of the earliest settlers in the Transvaal, long before the country bore that name, and was only inhabited by native tribes. He had been quite a young man, though possessed of good means when the Dutch first broke out into the resistance of the English rule. Aware of the hopelessness of rebellion and unwilling to take part against his countrymen, he had withdrawn with the considerable falling of his rule dependence into the then unknown regions lying to the north of the Orange River. Here he had purchased land of one of the native chiefs, built his house, and then enclosed his farm. And here he had lived ever since, all the numerous changes which the country had undergone paying as little heed to them as if he had belonged to another planet. He had never married or felt any inclination to do so. He had ridden about his fields and reared his cattle and sent them to the market, and brewed his Dutch beer year after year, with a placid contentment which is rarely witnessed, even in a Dutchman. If he was indolent, he was at all events extremely good-tempered, and his oldest servants scarcely ever remembered to have seen him ruffled. He had lived alone until within the last few years, never seeming to experience the want of a companion. But about 2 years since his solitude had been broken in upon by the arrival of his nephew, Rudolph Kransberg, a tall, gawky youth of 22, who came to claim his help and protection. His father, a merchant in Grahamstown, had died insolvent, and his son, calling to mind for the first for a great many years his uncle in the Transvaal, had made a journey hither in the hope of gaining a kind reception. In that he had not been disappointed. The old man heard of his arrival and of the misfortunes which had befallen his brother, without exhibiting the smallest emotion, but at the same time he gave the young man shelter and maintenance, allowed him, in fact, to live in his house, treating him in all respects as though he had been his own son. Rudolph, who in many respects resembled his relative, accepted the situation with equal complaisance, and they had now lived together 2 years in perfect contentment, not a word having been exchanged between them as to the older man's disposal of his property or the younger one's prospects in life, till within the last few weeks, when Rudolph had consulted his uncle on the subject of a marriage which he was anxious to contract. The two were sitting in the garden in a Dutch summer house, which old Kransberg had run up with his own hands some 40 years before. It was generally thought that the old man liked the society of his nephew, and especially during the smoking of the evening pipe, though he never expressed any feeling to that effect, or, indeed, to any effect whatsoever, unless compelled by absolute necessity. He was therefore somewhat surprised when one evening Rudolph took his pipe from his lips, and after rolling out a long puff of smoke addressed his uncle. "My uncle, there's something I would ask you. May I speak?" The old man similarly removed his pipe, emitting a corresponding puff, and then answered briefly, "Yeah." "My uncle, I am 4 and 20." He paused, but his uncle, not considering this to require a verbal acknowledgment, only nodded. "My uncle, it is time I was married." This apparently was regarded as calling for a reply. The pipe accordingly was again removed, and Mynheer inquired, "Whom?" "Thirza Rivers." Another long silence followed this communication, after which the old man remarked, "Englishwoman." "True," assented the nephew, roused by his feelings to unusual prolixity of speech. "But she has always been bred up in our ways, and her father-in-law is a good man." Old Cransburg again gave an affirmative nod. "Go over and ask her," he said. Rudolph nodded in his turn, and so the conversation ended. It was on the day following that this Mynheer Kranzberg, as he was proceeding after supper to smoke his usual pipe in the summer house, was startled by the discharge of a gun at a short distance. As the reader has heard, the country had been for some time infested by bands of ruffians who committed great depredations in the neighbourhood. The old man's first idea was to summon his servants and send them out to see after the marauder. But, casting his eyes along the road, he saw the figure of a man lying prostrate, having apparently been shot. Straightway he summoned two of his Hottentots and desired them to bring the wounded man or his body, as the case might be, into the house. It was soon discovered that there was no wound, but the stranger had a dangerous attack of fever of some kind, and was in imminent danger of his life. Without more words he had him consigned to the bed in his guest chamber, where he and his nephew nursed him with all possible kindness until he recovered his consciousness, as the reader has heard, and appeared to be in a fair way of recovery. George soon made acquaintance with both uncle and nephew. No great effort, indeed, was necessary to form such an acquaintance. All that was required was to sit still and smoke, exchanging, it might be, 2 words in the course of every hour. During all this time Rudolph's courtship had been held in abeyance, as it was necessary for him to stop at home and assist his uncle in nursing. It was not possible he could be spurred to ride over 20 miles to Umtongo. If the swain had been a Frenchman or an Italian, or even an Englishman, it might have been argued that his attachment to the lady was not a very ardent one. But that would have been to mistake the case. Rudolph was very sincere in his devotion, and was anxious that his visit should not be delayed any longer, and he had ordained in his own mind that he would set forth on his errand the following day, when he was greatly startled by a question which his guest put to him. George had been sitting, as the reader has heard, in his host's garden, enjoying the scent of the delicious flowers, when he saw Rudolph Kranzberg advancing towards him. The young Dutchman bestowed a nod upon him, his usual greeting, and then, sitting down on the bench beside him, lighted his pipe and began to smoke. Presently George inquired whether Rudolph could tell him of a farmhouse in that neighbourhood called Umtongo, the residence of a farmer named Ludwig Manson. Rudolph was so startled that he had actually dropped his pipe. He stooped, however, to pick it up again, before he repeated the words, "Umtongo, Ludwig Manson?" "Yes," said George, supposing that his companion did not understand him. "I was on my way to his house when I was taken ill. The farm must lie at no very great distance. Perhaps you may be able to tell me where it is?" "You're going there?" ejaculated Rudolph with more animation. "Yes, I was going there, and I want to go there now." "It will not be fit for you to go for a long time yet," returned the Dutchman, relapsing into silence, from which he could only be roused to make monosyllabic replies. A minute or two afterwards, indeed, chancing to see his uncle in the distance, he got up and went to join him. George was perplexed, but the demeanour of his hosts had puzzled him from the first. He saw, however, that they meant kindly by him, and supposed that Rudolph was simply afraid that he might bring on a relapse by venturing on a long ride in his present weak condition. He knew indeed he was not fit to make the attempt yet. Impatient, therefore, as he was to rejoin his mother and sister, he resolved to remain quiet for a few days more. He was more ready to do this because he felt his strength returning to him every day, and it was evident from Rudolph's manner that his stepfather's house lay at no great distance. He was a good deal surprised when on the following evening Rudolph Kranzberg, who had been absent all day, returned to Malapos Kloof, but with a companion. He was sitting alone in the arbour, the time for old Kranzberg's pipe having not yet arrived, when a well-known figure suddenly presented itself, and the voice of Reggie Margaret greeted him. "Hooray, old fellow! This is glorious indeed! Why, here have we been scouring for this country for you for weeks past, and your mother and Theresa, your mother and your sister," added Reggie, correcting himself, "have put off going into the mourning for you day after day, only because they couldn't bear to think you were dead. And here have you been alive all the time, only 20 miles from us. Old Kranzberg, they say, never holds back any intercourse with his neighbours, and it must be so, or you must have heard of the hue and cry that has been raised. Matamor had gone back to Horner's kraal, and we only heard from some people in Heidelberg of his having parted company with you somewhere near Kudu's Vley. We searched the whole country, Hardy and Haxo and I, and some of Ludwig Manson's men, and we found at last the skeleton of your horse. We knew it by your saddle, and by its spring, where it was quite clear you had camped for the night, there were the remains of one of the most venomous snakes in the country. We were afraid you had been bitten by it, and had staggered somewhere into the bush and died. There would have been small chance for you, they said, if it had bitten you, but it doesn't matter. Happily, what we thought, only I should like to know if you are able to tell me the true history of the matter." "You shall hear presently," said George, "but first of all I want to know about my mother. Is she looking well?" "Well, I never saw her before, you know," said Reggie, "and of course she has been in great distress about you. But as regards looks, I'm sure she's an extremely handsome woman, and she will soon now be at her best again. You should have seen her what a difference there was in her when we found out all about you from young Kranzberg." "Young Kranzberg," repeated George. "I suppose he guessed the truth, then, from what I told him yesterday, and rode over to tell you about me." No," said Margetts shortly. "That wasn't the object of his visit. He didn't know that you were in any way connected with Mrs. Manson. Didn't know what your name was indeed. He only mentioned quite casually at dinner that a young Englishman had been found close to his uncle's house nearly 2 months ago, who had been seized with a bad attack of marsh fever. We all caught it at once, and felt almost sure from his description that the person of whom he had been speaking must be you. But Mrs. Manson couldn't bear to be kept in suspense a moment, and I offered to ride over here the moment dinner was over, and Rudolph Kranzberg," added Reggie with something of a chuckle, "was obliged to accompany me." "Well," said Rivers, "but there's plenty more I want to know. I haven't seen my sister since she was quite a child. She must be grown up now." "Yes, she is grown up," assented Reggie shortly. "And she promised to be pretty?" "That's a matter of opinion," said Reggie with evident embarrassment. "Some people, I believe, do think her so." "But you don't, said George, glancing at him in some surprise. "But never mind that. I shall soon be able to judge for myself. There are other things I want to know about. What has become of the Vanderheedens?" "Oh, they are all right," said Margetts. "Vanderheeden recovered rapidly and got home in 3 weeks after the time you left us. Their place is only a few miles from Umdongo. They have been continually over there to see your mother and sister. Miss Vanderheeden and Miss Rivers have struck up a very close friendship, and I must do Vanderheeden the justice to say that nobody has been more active in the search after you than he was." "He is a good fellow," said George, "though he is a Dutchman and hates the English, and is as proud as Lucifer into the bargain. Well, and Hardy, what of him?" "Hardy is at Peter's door. That's the name of Vanderheeden's place. He has designed the Capitol House, which they have already begun building. It will go on all the faster now that the search for you is happily over. Well, now, it's my turn, George, to ask questions. Do you think you're strong enough to be moved? Mr. Manson proposes to send over his light bullock wagon for you. Of course, you can sit in the saddle for 20 miles and wouldn't be fit to do so some time yet. But you might be able to bear the motion of the wagon. You look quite as strong as Vanderheiden did, and you haven't so far to go. I should think I certainly might, said George. I don't know whether it is in consequence of seeing you and hearing your good news, but I feel ever so much better than I did this morning, said Margaret. Then I will write back at once and tell them to send the wagon. It will take 1 day to come here, then you can go back the next. That will be the day after tomorrow, you know. Very good. I must of course consult my kind host, but I don't fancy he will make any difficulty. We shall have to arrange, also, what I am to pay him for my lodging and nursing. I must have been a considerable expense, as well as trouble to him. Margaret took his leave, and George went in quest of Mynheer Kransberg, whom he found in his usual seat in his summer house. He listened in silence to George's proposed arrangements, as well as to his thanks for the great kindness shown to him. But when his guest inquired how much money was due for the lodging and attendance he had received, Mynheer Kransberg answered quietly, "There is nothing due. This is not an inn." "I am aware of that," returned Rivers, colouring a little, for he had entertained the idea that all Dutchmen were eager to make any profit in their power, and had spoken accordingly. "But I must have occasion for some considerable outlay, and besides, have given your servants and yourself and nephew a great deal of trouble," he pursued. "We do not, any of us, grudge it," said the old man in the same tone as before. "We do not want money for doing a simple act of Christian charity. You have rendered me your thanks. That is enough." "I do indeed render them most heartily," said Rivers, "and I shall never lose the recollection of your generous kindness." During the journey in Farmer Manson's ox wagon, which occupied nearly the whole of the day, he had time to reconsider the opinion which he had formed respecting the Boers, and which had been very much the same that is entertained by Englishmen generally. There is undoubtedly a strong prejudice felt against them. They are believed to be selfish, cold-blooded, and cowardly, harshly oppressive to the helpless, but descending to falsehood and trickery in their dealings with those whom they dare not open defile. A good deal of disgust also is felt at the strictness of the religious profession, which is thought to be inconsistent with their harsh and worldly conduct. That there is some truth in these censures is not to be denied. They have been for many generations slaveholders, and no nation ever yet escaped the degradation which that most odious of all customs entails. Slaveholders become inevitably selfish, unjust, and brutal, and inclined to become cowardly also. It is the coward only that oppresses the weak, and they who habitually oppress the weak cannot but become cowards. But the Boers have virtues to which justice has not been done. They are kind-hearted and generous to all except the blacks. No nation exceeds them in industry, in simplicity of life, and in the practice of domestic virtues. The profound respect rendered to parents, the faithful affection subsisting between husband and wife, the anxious care bestowed on their children, the loyal attachment and devotion to their country, might put to shame many who are their severest censors, and their religious profession is sincere enough, however blinded their eyes may have become as regards some obvious Christian duties. Prayer is offered in almost every Dutch household morning and evening to Almighty God. The Sunday is given up to the strictest religious observances. The periodical communions are punctually and reverently attended. If the curse of slavery could be torn out by the roots, and the natives recognized by them as of equal value with themselves in the sight of heaven, there would be few worthier races to be found on the face of the earth than they. End of chapter 20. Recording by Anushka.
Chapter 21 of Perils in the Transvaal and Zululand. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Deborah Lee. Perils in the Transvaal and Zululand by H.C. Adams. Chapter 21. "Here is a letter for you, George," said Mrs. Manson, as the former entered the parlor at Umtongo, about 3 months after his arrival at his mother's house. "It looks like Mr. Rogers' handwriting, but I believe Mr. Rogers is still in England." "It is from him, though," said George when he had finished reading the letter. "He has returned to Dykeman's Hollow. Has been there about a fortnight, he says." "What has made him come back so much sooner than he had intended? He wrote us word that his business in England was prospering, but he would be obliged, he thought, to remain another 12-month. "Ah, but there is, it appears, a total change of things in England. Another government has come in, and is likely to reverse altogether the policy of the old one. He says, too, that a lot of people have taken up Cetewayo's cause, and declare that he is a very ill-used man, that he never hurt or wronged anybody, and if we had left him alone, he would have left us." "Do they?" said Mrs. Manson. "I wish some of them had been Cetewayo's neighbors, as we were." "Well, the upshot is that Mr. Rogers thought it was of no use for him to stay any longer in England, so he has come back. And now he wants me to go back to Dykeman's Hollow and take up my old work as schoolmaster and teacher." "Well, I hoped you were going to settle here," said Mrs. Manson. "There is as much need for your services here as there could be at Dykeman's Hollow, and my husband would be willing, as you know, to give you a part of this farm to look after, quite as large as you could manage, and to build you a house to live in, or rather, I should say, enlarge the small house at Droopsdorf. 2 more rooms would make it a comfortable house." "He and you are very kind, Mother, but you see, I engaged myself to Mr. Rogers, and I ought to keep my engagement." "Yes, but that was 1.5 years ago, and things have happened since then which make all the difference. Mr. Rogers didn't know that we had removed from Spielman's Vlae, and that you, by engaging yourself to him, would be not half an hour's ride from us, but a good week's journey at least. And you didn't know it, and couldn't guess it either." "No doubt that is true, Mother, and I must allow that if I had known that there would be all the width of the Transvaal between you and me, I shouldn't have made the agreement. But, you see, I did make it." "Yes, but I don't think Mr. Rogers could refuse to cancel it. It would be very unhandsome of him if he did. Then again, I don't suppose he has heard of your long illness. He thinks you have been living with us nearly 6 months, as Mr. Margetts has, whereas for 3 months, or for 2 at all events, you didn't come here at all, and for a good month more you were quite an invalid. I haven't had more than 2 real months of you yet, my dear boy, and after so long a separation, I may say after what seemed like a recovery of you from the grave, I can't afford to part with you. Isn't that reason, Tirzah?" "Yes," answered Tirzah. "I think Mr. Rogers would at least give you a longer holiday if he didn't consent to your staying here altogether. I know Father thinks so too." "I'm sure I don't want to leave you," said George, looking affectionately at his mother and sister. "I have never been made so happy by anything as by finding you." Mrs. Manson and her daughter were indeed 2 relatives of whom anyone might be proud. The mother was a little past middle age, but was still strikingly handsome, and though her dress differed in some particulars from that of any English lady, she would have passed muster, both as regards appearance and manners, in good English society. Her daughter nearly resembled her in height and feature, and if the reader could have seen her, he would not have been surprised that even the ponderous Rudolph Kranzberg should have been captivated by her charms. She was a lively girl in her 19th year, and, as yet, fancy-free. It had never occurred to her that Mynheer Rudolph had viewed her with any sentiment of admiration, and we are afraid that, if the idea had entered her head, it would have had no other effect than that of affording her unmixed amusement. "And it isn't Father only," pursued Tirzah, "who wants you to remain at Umtongo. There's another person." "Reggie Margetts, I suppose," interrupted George. "I have no doubt he likes his quarters well enough." "Mr. Margetts," broke in Tirzah hastily, and with a little accession of color. "I wasn't thinking of him. I don't suppose he knows his mind on that subject or any other. No, it is a different person altogether." "My dear Tirzah," interposed Mrs. Manson, "there is your father out in the garden beckoning. He wants you, I am pretty sure. Go out and speak to him." Tirzah departed, and Mrs. Manson, after a pause of a minute or 2, addressed her son in a tone of some embarrassment. "I am sorry you said that about Mr. Margetts," she said. "Sorry for 2 reasons. In the first place, I fancy, if indeed it is only fancy, that he is attracted by Tirzah." Reggie is as easily attracted by a handsome girl as a bee is by a honeysuckle, said George, but his attachment does not generally last much longer. I hope you may be right, returned his mother, but I own I think otherwise. I grant Tirza either does not see, or does not much care for, his presence, but how long that might continue I do not know. Well, mother, even if it were so, what objection is there to Reggie Markets? He is a gentleman by birth, well educated, and a capital fellow every way. Tirza might do much worse. No doubt, but he is, I understand, in no position to marry. He is a younger son with no fortune, only a precarious allowance, and his family would probably be opposed to such a marriage. That is true, assented George. But then Reggie is too honorable a fellow to engage Tirza's affections if he did not see his way to marrying her. Very likely he would not intentionally make her fond of him, but he might do so nevertheless. No, George, it is certainly better that he should leave Umtongo, and my idea is that he should go and take your place at Dykeman's Hollow. We had both better go, said George. There is a reason. Yes, I think I understand it, interrupted Mrs. Manson. And I was going to say I was sorry you introduced Mr. Market's name, because it led to Tirza's remark. You would not like her to speak to you on the subject, but may not I do so? George again colored and walked once or twice across the room. Then he spoke. I do not affect to misunderstand you, mother. I know to whom Tirza meant to refer, but hear me for a moment, George. I can understand your unwillingness to address Miss van der Heyden, knowing as you do her brother's rooted dislike to the English. But you do not know all that I know. When the brother and sister reached home several months ago, we were just beginning to be seriously anxious about you. Rumors reached us first, that you had been one of a party attacked near Heidelberg, and secondly, that you had left your friends on the day after the attack and had set out for Umtongo. What had become of you during the last month? Of course we were anxious and alarmed, and the alarm soon spread. Miss van der Heyden herself came over here to inquire. Her distress had completely broken down all the barriers of reserve. She did not indeed tell us of her attachment to you, but it was impossible for us not to see it. After another month of continual inquiry, we were all convinced that you must have perished in the bush. Then Ankin spoke to me. She could not, in fact, keep it to herself. Considering you as no longer belonging to this world, she told me of the vows of affection which had been interchanged between you. They never ought to have been, said George. I was to blame. But I should be still more culpable if I allowed myself to be influenced by what you have told me. It cannot be, and that is all I have to say. Yet, he resumed a few minutes afterwards, I am not sorry that we have had this conversation, painful as it has been. You know now my main reason for wishing to return to Dykeman's Hollow. It has been very nice being with you and Tirza, but Umtongo is too near Petersdorf for me to fix my residence there. Perhaps, by and by, when she has married and gone away. There is but little chance of her marrying anyone, unless it is yourself, George, interposed Mrs. Manson. That may be so, I cannot say, but as our wishes can never be fulfilled, it is unwise, indeed it would be cruel in me, were I to reside where my continual presence must needs be continually thrust upon her. Only one word more, George. Is your scruple founded on your want of money? Do you know that Umtongo is my property, not my husband's, and that it will of course one day come to you? I have already said that we would provide you with a house and an income at once, but the future also would be provided for. Mr. van der Heyden could not allege. My scruples, as you term them, have no connection with money. You must urge me no more. I must go, and at once. I shall speak to Margits without delay, he continued. He too will be sorry to leave Umtongo, but I shall be much surprised if he does not fall in with my suggestion at once. Meanwhile, Tirza, who had joined her stepfather in the garden, was having an interview with him which altogether took her by surprise. Old Ludwig Manson, he was always called Old Ludwig, though he wanted a year or two of 50, was a man very generally respected and beloved. To the shrewdness of the Dutchman and his placid temper, he added a generosity and unselfishness which are not so common with that people. He was particularly fond of his stepdaughter, and was just now greatly pleased at a piece of information imparted to him a few days before, which he considered to be the best possible thing for her, and of which he was now going to apprise her. On the previous Monday he had ridden into Zeerost to attend a meeting convened for the purpose of protesting against the annexation of the Transvaal, which had taken place several years previously, but which had become every year more odious in the eyes of the Boers. At Zeerost, to his great surprise, he had met old Kransberg, who also had ridden in from Malipo's Kloof. Manson knew that his neighbor cared no more about the annexation than he did himself. Influenced probably by his English connections, he did not regard the rule of Queen Victoria with any aversion, and knew that, although the English might administer the law with little regard to Boer prejudices, they would at least administer it justly. As for old Kransberg, he had seen too many changes of government to care much who governed the country, so long as they maintained law and order. This was so well known to Ludwig that he could hardly believe his eyes when, on turning from a bridle path into the road near Zeerost, he fell in with Kransberg leisurely riding along in the same direction. Zeerost is one of the loveliest spots in the whole of the Transvaal. It lies in a valley nearly surrounded by hills, which rise to a considerable height on the north, east, and south, while towards the west the level plain extends into the far distance, beyond the range of human vision. It differs from many other valleys of the same country in being supplied abundantly with water throughout the entire year. The vegetation is in consequence always of the freshest green, and every kind of tropical fruit and grain is cultivated, and yields a rich return. The town into which the neighbors rode is not large, but consists of solid, substantial houses, with the great Dutch Presbyterian meeting house towering in its center. In the marketplace adjoining, the horses and wagons of the Boers from the neighborhood were grouped together, while the owners were flocking in to take part in the meeting. Manson and Kransberg did not join them. At the request of the latter, they betook themselves to the principal inn, where, with much solemnity, but no unnecessary expenditure of words, he made his communication to his neighbor. His nephew Rudolf, it appeared, had arrived at the conclusion that a marriage between himself and Ludwig's stepdaughter would be a desirable arrangement if it could be arrived at, and he desired permission to pay formal addresses to her if agreeable to her parents. Old Ludwig replied with equal gravity that he would inform his wife of the proposal, an answer to which should be sent in due season. The two Gerontes then adjourned to the town hall and listened with imperturbable stolidity to the speeches delivered. Ludwig rode home, as has been intimated, much pleased with what he had heard, but he did not proceed immediately on his arrival at Umtongo to pass on the news, as an English parent would probably have done. He took an opportunity, a day or two afterwards, when there was nothing of importance to attend to, of communicating it to his wife. A debate was held, at which it was agreed that a message should be sent to Malipo's Kloof, inviting young Rudolf Kransberg to pay a visit at Umtongo on the following Monday, and that shortly before his arrival, Tirza should be apprised of his visit and its purport. Mrs. Manson therefore had had a twofold object in sending her out of the room. First, to stop her malapropos remarks about Inchen van der Heyden, and secondly, that she might be informed respecting Rudolf's visit. Tirza herself, however, did not anticipate any more important communication than that possibly her stepfather had purchased a new dress for her in Zeerost. She was a good deal surprised when he inquired of her what might be her exact age. 19 last December, father, she answered. 19, he repeated gravely. It is an early age at which to marry. I dare say it would be, she answered, somewhat startled. But then, I'm not going to marry. You do not know that, he observed gravely. An offer of marriage has been made for you, in most respects a suitable one. An offer of marriage to me? Repeated Tirza in astonishment. I did not say to you, but for you, he replied. The offer will not be made to you just yet. And who is to make it? Inquired the damsel hastily. You know my neighbor, Mynheer Kransberg of Malipo's Kloof. Yes, but I suppose he doesn't want to marry me, cried Tirza. Why, no, my daughter, returned Ludwig with a broad smile. He is somewhat past the age of matrimony. Nay, it is his nephew Rudolf. Rudolf Kransberg? Again exclaimed Tirza. He wishes to marry me. Even so, rejoined Ludwig. Does the idea surprise you? I should as soon have expected the wooden soldier outside your summer house to make love to me. "Nay, Tirza," said Manson in a displeased tone, "this does not become you. He is a worthy youth, and deserves due consideration." "Well, but I may tell him as soon as he comes. I suppose he is coming?" "He comes today," answered Ludwig. "Well then, I may tell him I can't marry him, and there will be an end of it." "By no means. Matters cannot be settled so hastily. Do you remember that he came over here about 3 months ago?" "Oh yes, when we found out that George was at his uncle's house. I remember that quite well. Well, it appears that he came over with credentials from his uncle then, intending to address you. But Mr. Margetts, not suspecting his purpose, insisted on riding back with him at once. If he had known the object of his visit, Mr. Margetts would not have so taken him away." Not feeling quite so sure of that, Tirza remained silent for a minute or two, and then rejoined, "But if he has put off any renewal of his visit for more than 3 months, he cannot be very much in earnest about this." "You do not understand our ways. We do not do things in a hurry. No, Tirza, you must receive him with all consideration, and must not, at all events, reject him before he makes his offer." "And how long will it be before he makes it?" "I cannot say. Probably some months. He will come over occasionally, at intervals, and then you will receive him in the proper manner." "And what is the proper manner?" inquired Tirza, who was growing more and more discomposed at every fresh detail. "Why, when he arrives, you will of course shake hands with him. Then he will probably say no more to you till after supper. Then he will remain in the parlor, and then you will wait till we are gone to bed, and then go to him." "Gracious, father, you are not serious." "Perfectly so, Tirza. The room will be dark, but you will take a piece of candle with you which you will light, and the interview between you will last until the candle has burned out. Then you will retire to bed, and he will ride home. That is the usual custom." "And who is to provide the piece of candle?" "You must do that. But stop a moment, Tirza. The candle must be sufficiently long to allow of a proper interview. I have heard of young women taking not more than half an inch of candle." "I shouldn't have taken a quarter of an inch," muttered under her breath, "if it had rested with me." "I must insist that a proper-sized candle is used, not less than 3 inches long. Your mother will provide it and place it on your table. And here is the young man coming," he added. "I hear his horse's steps outside." Tirza fled to her room, resolved at all events not to encounter her swain before supper time. Meeting George and Reggie an hour or 2 afterwards, she confided to them her troubles and implored them at all events to keep her unwelcome suitor engaged until she was obliged to meet him at supper. "See him while a bit of candle is burning!" exclaimed Margetts, to whom the custom seemed as outré as it had to Tirza. "Why don't you take a bit of candle as thin as a crown piece? You'd soon have done with him then." "Ah, I thought of that," said Tirza, "but they won't allow it. My mother has looked up a piece of candle long enough for an hour and a half's interview, and laid it on my dressing table. I must take that with me, and however I am to endure an hour and a half of it, I cannot think." "Well, you must make the best of it," said Reggie. "George, I think you had better take her out for a walk till supper time. I'll go in and entertain the enamoured gentleman, if he requires entertainment." On entering the parlor, however, it did not appear that the soupirant for Tirza's favour either expected or desired any entertainment. He had duly arrived, looking very stiff and solemn in his new leather and buckram suit, and after shaking hands with everybody all around, had seated himself in the corner, where he had remained ever since without speaking a word to anyone. So he continued the entire afternoon and evening until the supper hour arrived, and he took his place at the table with the others, but carefully keeping the whole length and breadth of the table between himself and the object of his affection. Not a syllable did he utter during the meal, and Tirza had come to believe that he had changed his mind and did not intend to address her, when suddenly, a few minutes before the party broke up for the night, he moved across the room and whispered in her ear, though loud enough for everyone to hear, "I say, we'll sit up tonight." The dispersion of the party delivered Tirza from the necessity of replying, and presently everyone had retired to his chamber, excepting Rudolf Kranzberg, who remained in the parlor, which was now pitch dark, and George and Reggie, who lingered in the passage. "I say, George," said Margetts, "shouldn't you like to see the courtship?" "Well," answered Rivers with a smile, "I must say I should, but of course that is impossible." "No, it is not," rejoined the other. "Look here, the big dresser runs right through the wall, and there is a cupboard behind that communicates with it. Through the cracks in the door you can see everything that passes." "Wouldn't Tirza dislike it?" suggested George. No, I'll be bound she would be as much amused as we are. It isn't as though she cared a straw for him." "Well, that's not unlikely," rejoined Rivers. "Come along, then. I must own I am curious to see it." "Creep in here," said Margits, opening a door in the wall, "and mind you don't make any noise. There are some holes in the dresser through which we shall be able to see." Almost as he spoke, the door of the parlor opened, and Tirzah was seen standing on the threshold with a bit of candle in one hand and a matchbox in the other. She proceeded to light the former and placed it in an empty candlestick on the table, and then seated herself, not, as her swain had probably hoped, on the large, heavy, wooden-legged sofa which ran along one side of the table, but in the large armchair usually occupied by her mother. Rudolph, though somewhat disappointed at the position thus taken up, glanced nevertheless with approbation at the bit of candle provided, which, in his view of the matter, intimated that the lady was not disposed to abridge the length of the interview. He seated himself in a chair, as near as he could contrive to his inamorata, and looked admiringly at her. "I say," he said, after a silence of some 10 minutes or so, "I say, I think you are very nice. I admire you greatly." "You are very obliging," said Tirzah demurely. There was another pause, after which Rudolph spoke again. "I say, I mean to come over here very often to see you." "Indeed," replied Tirzah with a glance at the candle. Alas, not a quarter of it had yet been expended. "You don't dislike me, do you, Miss Rivers?" inquired her suitor, after a third and still longer interval. "I don't know why I should," was the answer. Deriving some confidence apparently from this extremely guarded expression of opinion, Rudolph made a further venture. "I should like to give you a kiss," he said. Not meeting with any response, and proceeding perhaps on that most delusive of all proverbs, that silence gives consent, he rose from his place and leaned over her chair, out of which she started with very evident alarm. Believing this to be only feigned reluctance, he pressed forward to urge his entreaty, when suddenly there came a loud explosion. The candle flew all to pieces out of the socket, scattering the tallow in all directions, and the room was left in complete darkness. George and Margits could hear Tirzah making her escape through the door, while the unlucky lover, wiping the grease from his clothes, made his way to the stable and rode off as fast as his horse could carry him. "Reggie, you villain!" exclaimed George, after they had retreated to their room and given vent to their laughter. "Reggie, you villain, that was your doing." "It was the plug of gunpowder, not I," pleaded Reggie. "Mrs. Rivers oughtn't to have left the candle all that time on Tirzah's dressing-table." "Did Tirzah know anything of the trick?" asked George. "On my honor, she did not." "Well, it is a good job we are going tomorrow, or there might be a serious row about this." End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of Perils in the Transvaal and Zululand. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sherry Morrow. Perils in the Transvaal and Zululand by H.C. Adams. Chapter 22. It was a Sunday evening late in December, about 9 months after the departure of George Rivers and his friend from Umtongo. George, who wore a suit of clerical black, had just returned from a long ride to Spilman's Vley, where he had passed the day. He was now a deacon, having been ordained by the Bishop of Pretoria a month or two previously. The weather was delicious, but very warm, and George was glad to sit down by his friend's side in a charming little summer house which they had built under the shade of a tall eucalyptus planted by Mr. Rogers when he first came to the Transvaal 40 years before. "Well, George, what sort of a congregation had you?" inquired Margits, "and how did you get on with your sermon?" "I had a very good congregation," was the reply. "The farmer who bought Spilman's Vley of my stepfather is an Englishman, an immigrant from a Berkshire village. He and his wife and grown-up children were all there, and so were nearly all the farm servants whom he had brought with him. He told me very earnestly how it delighted him to hear the church service. It was like a voice from old England, he said, and he couldn't tell me how glad they all were that a clergyman would come over from Umvelosa every alternate Sunday now, instead of once a month. And I dare say, When he was in Berkshire, he didn't think much of the church service, suggested Margetts. No, he often didn't go, he told me, and cared very little for it when he did. And it was the same with his labourers. They seldom miss a service here. Well, it is to be hoped that they will not come to neglect it again. Now it is once more within their reach. But how about the natives' service? Asked Reggie. Could you get on with that? I am afraid I made a good many blunders, said Rivers, especially in the sermon. However, nothing but practice will set that right. You think an interpreter doesn't answer? No, I'm pretty sure it doesn't. You know what Lambert told us about his interpreter when he first went to preach to the Kaffirs in Annise. No, I didn't hear that story. Lambert said he was puzzled how to address them, when it occurred to him that Children of the Forest was a title that would be sure to take their fancy, and he accordingly began his discourse to them in that way. He thought he had done it rather well, until one of his friends who had heard him, and who was a good Kaffir scholar, told him that the interpreter had rendered his Children of the Forest as little men of big sticks. That story determined me never anyhow to employ an interpreter. Reggie laughed. I think you are right, he said, and your Kaffir certainly improves. By the by, did you see Hardy? His house is only 7 or 8 miles off from Spilman's Vlae, and I am told he goes over when there is a service there. I believe he does, but he was not there today. Mr. Bacon told me he had gone to Durban, went about a week ago. Indeed. Do you know what took him there? I fancy he was sent for to make some report of the state of things in this neighborhood. You know he now holds an official position of some importance. Yes, which you might have had if you had liked it, George. He has the credit of having given them warning at Rorke's Drift in time to prepare themselves for the defense of the place. But it was you who brought them that information. I did not want the post, Reggie, and if I had, Hardy was the person really entitled to it. I did not know the way from Islamwana to Rorke's Drift, and could not have found it. And to say the truth, I should not have thought of the garrison at Rorke's Drift if he had not reminded me of it. No, he fully deserves his appointment, and I am heartily glad he got it. But I believe when he gets to Durban, he will warn the government that the Transvaal is not merely in a condition of discontent and disloyalty, but on the verge of an armed outbreak. Do you think it goes so far as that, George? An armed outbreak means a war with England, remember. What possible hope can they have in succeeding in that? No reasonable hope, of course. The 100th part of England's power would be enough to crush them. I don't suppose the Boers could bring 5,000 men into the field, and England could easily send 5 times that number, or 20 times that number if she chose. The Boers have but little discipline or material of war, or knowledge of strategy. England is a first-rate power in all those respects. It would be an absolute madness for the Transvaal to go to war with England, as it would be for a terrier dog to provoke a lion to fight with it. But, however great the madness, it does not follow that they will not do it. What can induce them? Their profound ignorance of the relative strength of the two countries. I was talking with a Boer of some intelligence who, I found, really believed that Holland was one of the great powers in Europe, the equal, if not the superior, of England. He knew nothing of history, apparently, since the times of Van Tromp and Admiral Blake. He fancied Islamwana had only been redeemed by a desperate and exhausting effort, which would have made it impossible for us to engage in any other war for a generation to come. The accidental circumstance that a quantity of newly coined money had been sent out here to pay the troops was enough to convince him that England was bankrupt, and driven to expend its last guinea. People who know no more than that of the true state of things may perpetuate any act of folly. No doubt, George, and I dare say also they argued that the disasters of Islamwana and Intumbe proved that the English were not so formidable in the field as their own troops had always been. They had repeatedly fought these Zulus, remember, and always with complete success. Exactly, no doubt they did, and do so argue. They were always on their guard, and we were taken off ours, and that made all the difference. But though the Dutch might practice their rude tactics with success on the natives, they will hardly get the English to approach them and be shot down after the same fashion. That is reckoning rather too much on even an Englishman's contempt for his enemy. But they mean mischief, these Boers. They are flocking down this way from all parts of the Transvaal. Whom do you think I saw today, of all people in the world? I don't know, indeed. Not old Cransberg, I suppose. Not old Cransberg, but I did meet the young one, our friend Rudolph. What should bring him here, or Gottlob Lisberg, or Hans Stockmar, or Julius Vanderbilt, or half a dozen other fellows from near Zeerust, whom I have seen about in the course of the last week, unless what they say is true, and they are going to rebel against the English government. It looks like it, I'm afraid. But about Rudolph Cransberg, did you come to speech of him? How did he receive you? I didn't come to speech of him, as he didn't say a single word. He received me as Dido did Annise in the infernal regions. What? He bears us some grudge for the trick played on him at Umtongo? I'm not at all sure that he realizes the fact that any trick was played on him. From what Lisberg told me, Lisberg is very intimate with him, you know. He fancies the explosion was the work of the evil one, and that we are in league with him. You know Theresa wrote us word that he had never turned up at Umtongo again. My mother thought it very odd, but she apparently still believes he is a suitor for Theresa's hand. I suppose Theresa herself has a pretty shrewd suspicion of the truth. I suppose she has, but if she guessed that Rudolph had taken up that notion, she would be quite content to let him entertain it. But the upshot, I fancy, is that Rudolph owes us one, and will pay it if he has the opportunity. He is as thorough a specimen of the sullen boar as I know, and your sullen boar is not a pleasant article. But Reggie, he added after a few minutes' silence, there is a matter which I have once or twice wished to speak to you about, but have always put it off. I have a fancy that you really do care for Theresa, notwithstanding your chaff about her. We are very old friends, and out here, cut off from the rest of the world, we are like brothers. I wish you would tell me the plain truth about this matter. Well, old fellow, what is the use of telling it? I don't see how anyone can live as long as I did in your sister's society and not care for her. She is simply the sweetest and most beautiful creature I have ever seen. But where is the good of my saying this, George? I can't ask her to marry me. I have nothing but a precarious allowance of £100 a year, and I am not likely to have anything more unless I can make it myself out here. But if Theresa likes you— I don't know she does, broke in Margetts. I have fancied once or twice that she does, but most likely it was all fancy. I am only saying, if she does like you, she will have something. Umtongo belongs to my mother, not to Mr. Manson. But Umtongo will come to you, George, said Margetts, surprised. I shall not want it. I shall never marry. This life here suits me much better than such a farm as Umtongo, though, no doubt, that is a very good farm. No doubt, assented his friend. I see what you mean, and I believe I understand you when you say you won't marry. But, in the first place, I hope you are mistaken there. And in the next, supposing everything else arranged as you wish, Theresa and I could never deprive you of your inheritance. No, George, I mean to stay here and work as I am doing now. I shall never make a parson, I'm not cut out for that. But I think I shall do well enough at farming and teaching. And, by the by, if your sister doesn't marry a boor, I may be in a position to ask her. Be it so, Reggie. I believe you are right, and this had better not be mentioned again. And here in good time comes Mr. Rogers. He is back from Newcastle earlier than I had expected. Mr. Rogers, whose acquaintance the reader made in the first chapter of the story, was an extremely worthy man. It would have been well for both England and South Africa if there had been more like him. Left an orphan when quite young, and possessed of a considerable fortune, he had always disliked the ordinary round of English social life, and desired the freer air and habits of a new country. As soon as he could overcome the reluctance of his guardian to the step, he had visited the colonies, and chosen out among them the border country of Natal and the Transvaal. There he had bought a large farm, large even for farms in that country, and built 2 or 3 different stations on various parts of it. Spilman's Vlei and Rylands were 2 of these, and here he placed men whose views accorded with his own. Ludwig Manson, though a Dutchman, had been one of these, and it was with considerable regret that he heard, soon after his arrival in England, of Mrs. Manson's succession to her uncle's property near Zeerust, and their removal thither. Notwithstanding his affection for colonial life, he was an Englishman to the backbone, and the blunders made by colonial secretaries, one after another, sorely disturbed him. In particular, the gigantic mistake of the annexation of the Transvaal so troubled him that he made an expedition to England in the hope of persuading the government to reconsider that disastrous measure. There was no doubt it was, for the moment, advantageous to the Boers, as a sentence of penal servitude would be less unwelcome to a convicted prisoner than a sentence of death. But when the danger of being hanged had passed away, it was not likely that penal servitude would be cheerfully accepted. Foreseeing the inevitable mischief that would ensue, Mr. Rogers had urged the repeal, or at all events, some modification of the decree. But the new government could not be induced to pay any heed to South African matters, being completely absorbed by domestic and continental questions, and Mr. Rogers went back to Umvelosa to do the best he could under the circumstances of the case. On the present occasion he had not returned from Newcastle, whither he had gone, as was his practice, to help in the church services on a Sunday, in the happiest frame of mind. Everywhere he saw the plainest indications of the mischief he had anticipated. Newcastle was full of Boers, who had come in from the more distant parts of the Transvaal, and their feelings and intentions could not be mistaken. Not only was the revolt designed, but it was close at hand. He greeted George and Reggie with his usual kindness, but his depression and vexation were evident. "Did you know that your stepfather and mother, as well as your sister, were on their way here?" he asked, addressing Rivers. "No, sir, I had no idea of it. I haven't had a letter for the last fortnight, and Theresa, from whom I heard 3 weeks ago, said nothing of any such intention." "No, I imagine it must have been a hasty thought, but they are certainly on their way to Newcastle, and will arrive in a day or two at furthest." "Who told you of it, sir?" asked George. "Perhaps it is some mistake." "No, that can hardly be. It was Hendrik van der Heijden who informed me. I met him in the street at Newcastle, where he arrived 2 days ago. Manson with his wife and daughter were to follow him very shortly. Miss van der Heijden is to travel in their company. Your brother thought it better." "What are all the ladies coming for?" inquired Reggie. "They are not going to fight the English anyhow." "No," said Mr. Rogers, "but it may not be safe for them to stay behind. Nearly all the able-bodied men among the Boers will take part in the rising. The Kaffirs and Hottentots would have it their own way, and they might insult or injure the white woman. I think van der Heijden and your stepfather, too, George, are quite right to bring their ladies with them." "I suppose van der Heijden is very hot about this," suggested Rivers. "Yes, he is determined enough, and he is a dangerous opponent to the English. He is a good officer, especially he understands his countrymen's mode of fighting, and knows from experience what are the faults into which our officers are likely to fall. And he is a desperate man into the bargain." "How so, sir? I do not understand you." "Don't you know the story of the girl who was killed by the Zulus not long before the Battle of Islamwana?" "Yes, I heard something about it, I believe, from Mr. Balin or Hardy, I don't remember which. Some female relative of his was killed in a very brutal manner, but they are always brutal, these Zulus. It was too sad a matter to be much spoken about. The lady, Lisa Van Cortlandt, had been engaged to him for some years, and he is said to have been greatly attached to her. She had been murdered just before he came up, and the sight of her mangled corpse drove him, they said, almost mad. It wasn't merely for the purpose of avenging her death that he enlisted in our army. At least so it is thought. He wanted, poor fellow, to get knocked on the head himself." "Well, that explains what I couldn't understand before," said Margetts. "Why he was so terribly vexed when it was settled that he was to remain at Rorke's Drift. He was for a time almost beside himself. And that, too, may account for his desperate exposure of himself during that night of the encounter with the Zulus," added Rivers. "I never saw a man so utterly insensible to danger. He hardly seemed to rejoice the next morning at his escape, poor fellow. He has had a hard lot in life." "Well, I agree with you, Mr. Rogers. I have no doubt he will fight desperately enough in this outbreak, if it really is going to take place. That, I am afraid, there is no doubt of. Van der Heijden told me as much. He wanted to know whether you and Margetts meant to volunteer again to serve in the English army. If you did, he said, you should leave the Transvaal immediately, or you might be arrested. He offered to give you a pass which would carry you across the frontier. It was very kind and generous." What did you tell him, sir? Asked Rivers. Oh, I said that you were now in orders, and, of course, would not think of fighting. As for you, Mr. Margetts, I said I did not know what you might do, but I would ask you and let him know if you required his help. I am obliged to him, said Margetts, but I have no idea of volunteering again. I consider this to be quite a different matter from the Zulu War, where it was a question whether barbarous or lawless cruelty should be put down. Unless I am myself interfered with, I shall not interfere in this business. I am glad to hear you say so, said Mr. Rogers. Then we shall all remain quietly here. I shall invite the Mansons to come and stay at Dykeman's Hollow, and I think they will come. It will be quieter and more comfortable for them than Utrecht or Newcastle, which are overcrowded. I have no doubt van der Heyden, who has a high command, will be able to secure us from molestation. Mr. Rogers was not disappointed in either expectation. In a few days Mrs. Manson and Theresa arrived, while Ludwig joined the assembled council of Boers, which was now sitting at Heidelberg, exerting himself to prevent the rising, which was evidently on the point of taking place. Simultaneously with the appearance of the ladies came the note from van der Heyden endorsing a protection from Pretorius for all the inmates of Mr. Rogers' household. Not long after, the standard of rebellion was openly displayed, and Ludwig joined his family at the Hollow. The Boers in all parts of the Transvaal now took the field with their Wesley Richard rifles, and all through the Transvaal the English were obliged to fly for refuge to towns or villages, where they were besieged by the Boers. Resolved not to provoke the animosity, or even the distrust of his neighbours, Mr. Rogers kept himself and all his employees within the bounds of his own domain, not even sending a letter or message to Newcastle, lest it might be supposed to have some political purpose. He advised his guests to also observe the same prudent demeanour. No doubt Mynheer Manson was a Dutchman, and one very generally respected, but his wife and stepdaughter were English, and they were the guests of an Englishman. And at this time national feeling, as it might be termed, ran so high that the merest trifle might be enough to cause a general outbreak. The Mansons would have had no inclination to act otherwise than as he advised, even if their sense of what was due to him as their host had not forbade them to do so. They regarded the strife that was in progress as a vexation and a calamity, and whatever might be the issue of it, they were anxious to see an end put to it. But the ladies felt the time hang heavily on their hands, and when one day had been expended on a visit to George and Reggie's cottage and garden, and an inspection of their farmyard and stock, and another to the church and school where he ministered and taught, they were at a loss of how to employ themselves. Until their host, by a happy inspiration, one day late in January, suggested a visit to Coleman's Cop, a most picturesque spot on the very edge of Mr. Rogers' estate, from which a wide prospect might be obtained of that part of the Orange Free State known as Harrismith. The road from Bloemfontein to Newcastle ran close beside it, and was visible for a long distance from the summit of the Cop, although the latter was so thickly wooded as to screen any visitors to it from being seen themselves by passing travellers. To this spot it was agreed that an expedition should be made on the following day, and the whole party, inclusive of Mr. Rogers, who acted as guide, set out after breakfast, on horses and mules, having sent some Kaffirs on before them to make the needful preparations. Coleman's Cop was situated on one of the spurs of the Drakensbergs, not ascending so high as to be bleak and chill, yet high enough to command a magnificent view of the landscape beneath, and there are few countries in the world in which so vast a panorama is visible from the higher lands as in the Orange Free State. It is not indeed an unbroken level, like the low country of the Netherlands, being continually varied by hill and ridge, but these hardly anywhere rise to any considerable height, so that from the slopes of the Drakensberg the eye may range in every direction, until the horizon line melts into the distance. It is a fertile and picturesque territory, watered by noble rivers, whose banks, for the most part, are fringed with foliage, rich with cornlands and fruit orchards, and pastures where sheep and oxen and horses were bred abundantly. The land on that side of the Drakensbergs being considerably more elevated than on that of Natal, the climate is cooler and more agreeable to European residents. A general cry of admiration broke from the visitors as they caught sight of it, and sitting down on the trunk of a fallen tree, they proceeded more leisurely to examine its beauties. "Well, sir, the Dutch have not much to complain of here, at all events," observed Reggie, after a lengthened survey of the scene. "I should have thought, for my part, that they might have been very thankful to the English for driving them here." "Well, so they might, Margetts," remarked Mr. Rogers, "if they had thought that the English had been anxious to find out pleasant quarters for them. But I am afraid the English thought of one thing only. That was clearing them out of their old abodes." "Yes," he resumed, "the Dutchman has made himself comfortable enough here, if John Bull will only leave him alone. But that John Bull is too philanthropic to do. Hey, Manson?" "There is no talk of annexing the Free State, is there?" asked old Ludwig with a smile. "Why, no, Ludwig. The annexation of the other hadn't proved an encouraging experiment, or I think it likely that it would have been proposed." "Well, sir," observed George, "that annexation took place with the free consent of the Boers, and it was designed in kindness to them." "Was it?" returned Mr. Rogers. "I have my doubts about that latter. No doubt the Boers agreed to it, or rather didn't object to it at the time, but it was very much like pulling a drowning man out of the water, on condition of his being your bond-servant forevermore. He would agree rather than be drowned. But I doubt whether you could call it his free consent. It was rather his forced consent, to my mind." "What would you have had England do, sir?" asked Reggie. "Help the Transvaal out of its difficulties without insisting on annexation," answered Mr. Rogers. "The policy would have been as wise as it would have been kind." "And you would have given them their independence back when they asked for it after the Zulu War, I suppose," said Margetts. "Would you give it to them now?" "I should certainly have given it on the occasion you name, when they had asked for it." It had then become clear that they did not really desire the annexation, and the only reasonable ground there could have been for it was shown by that request not to exist. "I think compliance would have been as wise as it would have been just, and would have gone far to smooth away all difficulties. It is, of course, a very different thing now. England cannot give to armed menace what she refused to give to peaceful entreaty. Compliance would have been worse than their previous refusal." "Well, sir," urged Margetts, "no one, to be sure, could think that the Boers would ever really get the upper hand in a regular war with England. I speak with all possible respect to Mr. Manson, but that is surely impossible." "No one who understands the strength and resources of the two countries could think it possible," returned Mr. Rogers, "but the Boers possess very little information on the subject, and the coloured races still less. They would all think that England yielded now, because her weakness, not her magnanimity, obliged her. But I still trust there will be no war. Enough of this. What is it you have been looking at so intently, Theresa, for the last 10 minutes? "I think it is a man on horseback," said Miss Rivers, "but the object is so far off that I cannot distinguish what it is." She pointed as she spoke to a black speck on the road that led from Winburg to Newcastle, which was moving towards them. They all watched it for several minutes, and then Mr. Manson said, "You have a long sight, Theresa. It is a horseman, and he is riding fast. He will pass almost close to us." "It is an English soldier, or a man who has been one," exclaimed Rivers presently. "There is no mistaking his seat on horseback." The rider continued to approach until he arrived almost immediately under the spot where they were sitting. Then George and Reggie started up, simultaneously exclaiming, "It is Hardy, I declare. Let us go down and speak to him." End of chapter 22. Recorded by Sherry Morrow.
Chapter 23 of Perils in the Transvaal and Zululand. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Florence Short. Perils in the Transvaal and Zululand by H.C. Adams. Chapter 23. Rivers and Margetts hurried down the steep descent without pausing to pick their way, and reached the bottom just as the traveller, whose horse was evidently tired out, passed them at a broken-winded canter, which was the utmost speed, apparently, to which the unlucky animal could be urged. "Hello!" shouted George. "Hello, Hardy! If it really is you, here are two friends of yours who would like to have some talk with you. if you can spare the time." The horseman drew his rein in evident surprise. "What? Rivers? Margets?" he exclaimed. "Well, this is a piece of good luck. I was just thinking that the best thing I could do would be to ride round by Dykeman's Hollow and ask you to help me. What brings you here?" "Oh, we have been confined within the bounds of Roger's property for several weeks, and we made up a party today to come here. More for something to do than anything else." "And why are you confined within the bounds of Dykeman's Hollow?" asked Hardy. "And who has confined you?" "Well, it is more prudence than necessity," said George. "We don't want to provoke the Dutchman to attack us." "You talk riddles," said Hardy, "but I have no time to solve them. Can you tell me where Pretorius, the great man among the Boers—" "Can you tell me where he is to be found?" "I don't know with any certainty," said George. "I expect he has gone southward with the others." "Southward? What do you mean?" exclaimed Hardy hastily. "What can he have gone south for?" "Well, he didn't tell me," said Reggie, "but I think I can form a pretty good guess for what he has gone." "It is to attack the English troops." "English troops?" repeated Hardy in evident anxiety and alarm. "What English troops? I did not know there were any in this neighborhood." "We hear that Sir George Colley is marching to the relief of Pretoria with, some say 1,000, some 1,500 men. Mr. Rogers thinks he has got as far as Newcastle, if not still farther north," said Rivers. "The relief of Pretoria?" again cried Hardy. "Is Pretoria besieged? Do you mean that the rebellion has actually broken out?" "No doubt of that," replied Margetts. "That is an old story now. The English have for 2 or 3 weeks past been besieged by the Boers in all the large towns, Pretoria, Potchefstroom, Sanderton, and there has been sharp fighting in several places about the end of December. 250 men belonging to the 94th Regiment were killed or taken prisoners at Brankersbruit, near Middelburg." "How did that come about?" asked Hardy. "Well, I suppose Colonel Anstruther didn't know that there was any chance of his being attacked. Didn't know, in fact, that any outbreak was likely to take place. Or his neglect of precautions would seem to be of a piece with what we remember. He was marching with a number of wagons and 250 men, as Reggie said, along the road, his train being half a mile long, when, at a place called Brankersbruit, 2 Dutchmen rode up to him and handed him a paper which was found to be a letter from Joubert, who calls himself the Boer General. It stated that the war had been declared between the Republic of Transvaal and England, and called on him to surrender his men and wagons. I suppose Colonel Anstruther hardly thought that the summons was seriously meant. At all events, there was no superior force visible to which he would be unable to offer resistance, and he only replied by forming his men in column and desiring them to move on, but Joubert had planted his sharpshooters under cover everywhere round, and they opened their fire on the soldiers before they knew of their presence." "That was it, certainly. In 10 minutes half the men had been shot down. They were entangled in a marsh, and had not been able to get sight of any enemy to shoot at in return." "Exactly. And then, I suppose, Colonel Anstruther surrendered." "Precisely. That is what he did, and he and his surviving men were taken prisoners. He could do nothing else, but I'm afraid this will prevent any good being done by my mission. You say this occurred some weeks ago?" "Yes," said Margetts. "The catastrophe near Middelburg took place on the 28th of last month, and this is the 28th of January." "What, 28th of last month was just about the time when I set out for Bloemfontein," cried Hardy. "It is most extraordinary that I never heard this before." "What have you been to Bloemfontein for?" asked Rivers. "I was sent there by the authorities at Natal," answered Hardy, "in consequence of a message from the Colonel Office in England. The Colonel's secretary wanted to come to terms with these Boers. I suppose he thought, as everyone else thought, that the annexation had been a most foolish procedure, and that it would be better to come to some reasonable understanding with the Boers than keep up an irritating quarrel with them." "Small blame to him for that," said George. "Well, go on." "He thought that Brant, the president of the Orange Free State, would be a good person to mediate between us and the Boers, and he sent me with a letter to him." "Did you see him?" asked Margetts. "Yes, I had 2 or 3 very satisfactory interviews with him. He seemed quite sincere in the desire he expressed of preventing bloodshed, and I am the bearer of a letter from him to Pretorius, which, as I was in hopes, would prevent any outbreak of hostilities. He certainly did not know when I left Bloemfontein that fighting was going on. I should be almost afraid it will be too late now." "Is it not extraordinary that no message was sent either from Durban or London to stop any proceedings until the result of the negotiations with Mr. Brant were known?" asked Rivers. "It seems to me, certainly," replied Hardy. "But very likely there are reasons for it, of which I know nothing. Well, anyhow, I had better carry President Brant's letter to Pretorius. It is only carrying out my orders, and cannot do any harm." "Not to anyone but yourself, Hardy," said Margetts. "But I am not sure it would be safe for you to put yourself in the way of these Boers. The leaders among them seem to behave well enough, but many of the subordinate officers, if one may call them so, are rude and brutal, and might shoot any Englishman who approached them, without inquiry and without listening to any representations." "You are right, Reggie, I'm afraid," said Rivers. "I think Hardy had, at all events, better go with us to Dykeman's Hollow, and consult Mr. Manson. He might go with him to Pretorius, and he is so well known to the Boers, indeed he is one of them himself, that there could be no danger in his company." "Are the Mansons at Dykeman's Hollow?" asked Hardy. "Yes, they are Mr. Rogers' guests, but they are nearer to us than that. They are up on the cop yonder, though the trees hide them from our sight. Leave your horses here in Reggie's keeping, and I will go with you up to the cop." Hardy accordingly dismounted, and he and George were just commencing the ascent, when 3 or 4 men, whose uniforms showed that they belonged to the 58th Regiment, came running down one of the narrow passes at the utmost of their speed, close to the spot where the 3 friends were standing. They had evidently just escaped from some great danger. Their trousers were covered with mud, so that the regimental stripe could hardly be distinguished. Their jackets were cut and stained with blood. 2 of them had lost their caps, and all had thrown away their arms, which would have impeded their flight. As they reached the corner of the road, they came in sight of George and Hardy, and would have turned another way if the last named had not called to them. "Hello, my lads!" he shouted. "What has happened, and where are you running to?" Hearing themselves addressed in English, the fugitives stopped, and one of them, a corporal from his dress, answered, "There has been a brush with the enemy at Lang's Neck, if you know where that is." "I know it well enough," returned Hardy. "It is a narrow defile, filled with rocky boulders, just the sort of place where these Dutchmen would take up a position quite out of sight, and shoot down our soldiers at their leisure. You don't mean to say, I suppose, that you attacked the Boers there?" "Yes, we did, sir," answered the corporal, "and to our cost. Half our men were killed or wounded in no time, and we couldn't see a single Dutchman to fire at in return. The rest contrived to retreat to the camp, or there wouldn't have been a man left alive. We were cut off by a party of mounted Boers, and offered to surrender to them, but they paid no heed, and fired on us, killing all but 2 or 3. They are after us still, I expect. They couldn't follow us on horseback up the mountain paths, but they are riding round, I believe, by another road. Can you shelter us?" "I suppose in strictness we oughtn't to," said Margetts. "But we can't see our countrymen shot down in cold blood. I'd rather take the chance of being shot myself. Come along with me, my lads. You can hide in the caves under Coleman's Cop. The Boers, unless they came from this neighborhood, won't know anything about them, and they will hardly venture in there after you, if they do. Only we must make all possible haste." He mounted Hardy's horse and rode off at a trot, the men following him as well as they were able. Rivers and Hardy watched them as they hurried along under the side of the steep cliff, and then turned into a narrow defile. "He is right, I suppose," said George. "We are bound not to interfere. But if the laws of civilized warfare are set aside, as it seems they are by these Boers, they cannot expect us to observe them so rigidly as giving these poor fellows up to be shot would amount to. Don't you think so?" "We have only their word that the Boers would give no quarter," said Hardy. "And it may be that they didn't understand what our fellows said. Still, I can't blame Margetts, if that is what you mean. But we had better make our way to Dykeman's Hollow, hadn't we? I suppose your friends will have gone home by this time." "All right," said Rivers. "Come this way." They began climbing the steep path and were nearly halfway up when they heard voices calling to them, and looking down saw a party of mounted Boers who were levelling their rifles at them and shouting to them to descend. "What do you want with us?" called out Hardy in Dutch. "We are not soldiers, and have nothing to do with this war." "You are English, I can tell that by your speech," answered the man who had hailed them. "I want to ask some questions of you, to which I mean to have an answer. You had better come down at once, or we will send some bullets to fetch you." This was evidently no idle threat. A dozen Boers had already taken their aim, and the path at the point at which the Englishmen had been stopped was without shelter of any kind. There was no help for it. They had to retrace their steps, and presently found themselves face to face with the leader of the Boers, who proved to be no other than Rivers' old acquaintance, Rudolph Kransberg. "Ha! It is you, Mynheer Rivers," he remarked with a scowl. "You are an English soldier, I think, though your companion said you were not." "I was an English soldier in the Zulu War," returned George, "but I left the army at its conclusion, and am now a clergyman of the Church of England." "I don't care for that. I want to know whether you have seen some runaways from the battle that has been fought at Lang's Neck. We are in pursuit of them, and they must, I think, have passed this way." "We have told you that we are not belligerents," replied George. "You have no right to question us." "Ha! I see you will not answer because you have seen your countrymen and know where they are. As to having no right, we will see about that. We are at war with the English, and the English are our enemies, though they may choose to say they are not. I shall make you my prisoner, and this person," he continued, turning to Hardy, "who is he?" "I am an Englishman, like Mr. Rivers," answered Hardy. "Like him, too, not a belligerent. Your president, Mynheer Pretorius, would not, I am sure, approve your proceedings." "You think so? Well, you may see him at Lang's Neck, and find out how much respect he will have for your rights." "We are quite willing to be taken before him," said Hardy. "We will accompany you to the camp and answer without objection any questions he may put to us." Rudolph appeared to be somewhat puzzled by this suggestion, but saw no reason why he should not agree to it. Indeed, it had already occurred to him that George Rivers was the stepson of Ludwig Manson, a man well known to and respected by the Boer leaders. Any violence used towards a near relative of his would probably be condemned by his superiors, and he further reflected that he had no kind of evidence that these two Englishmen had really encountered the soldiers. It was evidently no use to attempt any further pursuit of the runaways, every trace of whom had disappeared. "Very well," he said, after a few minutes of silence. "You shall go with us to Lang's Neck, and if the President is still there and chooses to see you, he will do so. You can ride on the saddles of 2 of the men, but I warn you, you will be shot without mercy if you make the slightest attempt to escape." They mounted accordingly, and the party rode off. George, who understood Hardy's maneuver, by which he would get access to Pretorius without attracting general attention, which it was his special object to avoid, made no demur to the arrangement. He further reflected that, as soon as he reached the Boer camp, he could ask for an interview with Vanderheyden, who would, no doubt, at once set him at liberty and grant him an escort to Dykeman's Hollow. Nothing worse, therefore, was likely to happen to either of them than a ride to the Dutch camp and a few hours of detention there. And to this he was so far from objecting that he was particularly anxious to learn from an authentic source what had really taken place and what was likely to ensue. They rode in profound silence, the Boers being habitually taciturn, and George and Hardy anxious under present circumstances to say as little as possible. Presently the narrow defile running between the lofty rocks and along the margin of the mountain streams was passed, and they entered the broken and wild country which extends between Newcastle and the border of the Transvaal. After an hour's ride, which would have been protracted to twice that length but for the Boers' knowledge of the ground, they reached the camp, where some 5,000 or 6,000 men had established themselves. George was at once struck with the difference between it and the camps to which he had been accustomed. There was an utter absence of military discipline to which he had been used. It bore more the appearance of a great camp meeting, at which every person provided for his own lodging and maintenance, and yet there was a readiness to carry out the orders of the general officers in command, which seemed to take the place of the regular routine of a camp. As they rode over the ground where the battle had been fought that morning, they passed numbers of men employed in the melancholy duties which follow only too surely on an armed encounter. Wounded men were being conveyed on stretchers to the farmhouses and inns, which had been turned into temporary hospitals. Others, whose injuries were too severe to permit of removal, were being ministered to on the ground as well as circumstances allowed, while several parties were engaged in digging graves to receive the dead bodies which lay scattered in all directions. One of these companies was working under the direction of Hendrik Vanderheyden, and the latter no sooner perceived the 2 Englishmen than he rode up to them, and, after a friendly salutation, inquired what had brought them to Lang's Neck. "This gentleman, Mynheer Kransberg, I am not aware of his military rank, but he has brought us here as his prisoners," replied Rivers. "Prisoners? You have not been—" "We have not been interfering in military matters at all," interposed George. "We had given you our parole not to do so, and, I need not say, have not broken it. We told Mr. Kransberg so." "Then how come this, Lieutenant Kransberg?" said Vanderheyden haughtily. "Mr. Rivers holds a protection which at my instance was granted to him by the President, which exempts him from all interference on the part of the military authorities." "He did not produce it," said Kransberg sullenly. "He had no time to do so," interposed Hardy. "But if you would grant me one moment, Commandant Vanderheyden, that I believe is your proper title, I will explain why the protection was not shown to Mynheer Kransberg. It was because I wished to avail myself of his escort hither. I am the bearer of a letter from Mr. Brandt, the President of the Orange Free State, to your President, Mynheer Pretorius, which he was in hopes would prevent the outbreak of war.
I regret to find I have arrived too late for that.
I regret also, Mr. Hardy, to say that you have. We have been attacked, and we have driven back our enemies with heavy loss. But we should have preferred to gain our object without spilling of blood. Just so, said Hardy. And you would prefer to gain it now without further bloodshed?
Undoubtedly,
assented Vanderhayden.
Then will you obtain me an audience with the President, at which I can still present this letter?
If the terms it proposes should be acceptable to him, an armistice may be agreed on, and the question of a settlement between the English government and that of the Transvaal may be discussed. I would take you to him this instant, returned the Dutchman, were it in my power to do so. But he is not at present in the camp. He has today gone northwards on business of urgent importance, nor can I say without inquiry when he will return. In his absence, I fear the Vice-President and the Commandant General, Joubert, could not discuss, certainly could not decide, a question of this importance. But if you will come with me, I will take you to General Joubert's quarters. I will go at once, but I should like to ask Rivers what he proposes to do, or rather, what you advise so far as he is concerned. He can, of course, return to Dykeman's Hollow if he wishes it, and I will send an escort with him. But I believe they are greatly in want of a clergyman to attend the sick and dying in the English camp. Perhaps if he knew that, he would prefer going there. I need not say he will be at full liberty to do so. But we can speak to him after you have seen Mynheer Joubert. We had better lose no time in going thither. Hardy accordingly followed Vanderhayden across the rugged and stony ground on which the action had been fought that morning, to a tent. It was the only one in the camp where the Commandant General had fixed his quarters. No difficulty was made about obtaining an interview, and Hardy almost immediately found himself in the presence of the rebel leader, as well as in that of another bearded and grave-looking personage, who, he was informed, was Kruger, the Vice-President of the newly proclaimed Republic. Hardy looked with interest at the Boer General, who, although he had not at that time attained all the celebrity now attaching to his name, had already achieved some brilliant successes. His family, as Hardy subsequently learned, was of Huguenot extraction, having migrated to the Cape at the time of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. But intermarriages with the Dutch in succeeding generations had had their effect, and Joubert had all the appearance of a genuine Boer. Like his fathers, he had followed the calling of a farmer, and had had no experience of warfare except with native tribes. But he was possessed of a rare military ability, and if he had had the advantage of professional training, would have made a great general. In personal appearance he was of middle height and powerful frame, with an unusually dark complexion, a beard and moustache, and features expressing intelligence and good humour. He was apparently somewhat advanced in years, though he had not passed the vigour of life. He received Hardy with civility, and, after he had heard his story, expressed his regret, as Vanderhayden had done, that the President was not in the camp, so that the matter might be immediately dealt with. Pretorius was expected back very shortly, and then instant attention should be given to it. Meanwhile, be assured, he said, that we desire peace with England, and are willing to concede everything to her except our national independence. You may not perhaps be aware that when the Volksraad declared that the Transvaal Republic was again established, it passed several resolutions which may well form the basis of negotiations with the agents of the British government. I have only just arrived in the country after an absence of several weeks, said Hardy, and have therefore had no opportunity of learning what those resolutions were. They are soon recited, said Joubert. The first proclaimed a general amnesty for all past offences. The second ratified all the acts of the British government up to the date of the proclamation, and the third declared that questions relating to foreign policy might be made matter of special discussion.
I think you will allow that these resolutions are not framed in any spirit hostile to your government. I must allow that they are not, replied Hardy. I should certainly hope that they might form the basis of negotiations satisfactory to both parties. That was also the opinion of the President of the Orange Free State. I may add, it is also the opinion of our countrymen in Holland, who have sent an urgent entreaty to the Queen of England that our national independence may be restored to us. The same sentiment has been expressed in other European countries, but I should hardly have thought that such a petition would require foreign support when it had once been submitted to the English people. They have ever been the first and most uncompromising of all nations in the assertion of their own liberty. Why should they grudge to others that which they value so highly themselves? You speak well, sir, said Hardy. I am unable to deny the force of your appeal. We may hope that when the President returns, communications may be opened with the English government which may lead to a settlement honorable and satisfactory to both parties. But meanwhile, ought not all hostile operations to be suspended? They could not facilitate any negotiations that might be set on foot, but they might seriously impede them. If the English general proposes an armistice, it will certainly be agreed to, said Joubert. On our side, we have no need to make any such proposition. If we are not attacked, we shall not ourselves make any attack. The British have only to do the same, and all fighting will be suspended. But, of course, if we are assailed, we shall repel the assault. Hardy bowed and took his leave. On returning to the place where he had left George Rivers, he found that the latter had already taken his departure for the British camp, where, as the reader has heard, his services were greatly needed. A few days passed without any resumption of hostilities, when, on the 8th of February, Sir George Colley unexpectedly sallied out of his camp, and the action at Hooch's Chain between Laing's Neck and Newcastle, on the banks of the Ngogo, was fought with a result as discreditable and damaging to the English arms as that of Laing's Neck had been. What has come to our generals and soldiers I cannot think, said Hardy to George, when he encountered him after the battle on the field, whither both had gone to minister to the wounded and dying. They seem to me absolutely to court defeat. The only comfort is that they will hardly make a third attempt after two such calamitous failures. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of Perils in the Transvaal and Zululand. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Perils in the Transvaal and Zululand by H.C. Adams. Chapter 24. It seemed as if Hardy's anticipations were going to be fulfilled. For more than a fortnight after the disaster on the banks of the Ngogo, both armies remained quietly in their camps, though both were largely reinforced. Negotiations had been opened with the English government, which bore every appearance of an amicable solution of difficulties. On the afternoon of the 26th of February, Hardy went down to the British lines, with a white flag dispatched by Joubert with him, to take some letters to George which had arrived from Dykesman's Hollow. It was some time before he could find his friend, the whole camp being in a state of extraordinary bustle and confusion. Officers and men were hurrying about. One of the guns had been brought out, the horses already harnessed, and the gunners and drivers belonging to it were all in readiness, it appeared, for some immediate movement. Every face bore token that something of grave importance was about to take place. "What does this mean, George?" asked Hardy as they shook hands. "Sir George Colley cannot anticipate an attack. Everything in the Boer camp, which I have only just left, is quite quiet, and the peace negotiations are proceeding prosperously." "I cannot tell you, Hardy, what it does mean," answered George. I hear vague rumors, but they are not to be trusted. One thing, however, is certain, and that is that Sir George Colley cannot get over his defeats by these Boers. I fancy he at first entertained the same contempt for them which English people generally feel. He thought that they were a race of cowards who would shoot down helpless savages from a safe distance, but dared not face soldiers in the field of battle. "We have already agreed that that is a mistake," observed Hardy. "Their mode of fighting is quite different from ours. They have no disciplined troops, as we have, and if they were to face us, as Sir George expects, on a field of battle, must inevitably suffer defeat. But they are brave and resolute men, and fight after their own fashion, which is as dangerous and disastrous to our troops as our mode of lightning would be to them." "Exactly," said Rivers, "and Sir George has chosen to fight after their fashion instead of ours, and these disasters have been the consequence. But that does not reconcile him to them. He is afraid that peace will be made before he has any opportunity of redeeming his military reputation, which he thinks has been terribly damaged by Laing's neck in the action on the Ingogo. He wants to give them one tremendous thrashing before peace is concluded, and the opportunity is lost." "I can well understand that," said Hardy, "though I think he is quite wrong. But I do understand you to mean that the preparations which I see going on are for another attack on the Boers? Really, I do not think that would be a defensible proceeding. If there has been no formal suspension of hostilities, there is a tacit understanding to that effect, which the Boers have most faithfully adhered to." "I'm afraid the preparations do mean that," answered George, "though, of course, I have made no inquiries, nor has anyone volunteered the information. I think Sir George means to attack the Boer camp again, though probably he will choose a different quarter from which to assail it." "It is to be hoped he will, at all events," rejoined Hardy, "unless he wishes exactly the same results to follow as before. Well, we shall soon know what is going to happen, for here comes Sir George and his staff. They are evidently about to set out somewhere." "Come to the high ground on the west of the camp," suggested Rivers. "You can see the whole road to the Dutch lines from it, and some of the wagons immediately under Amajuba Hill." "Amajuba Hill," repeated Hardy. "Is that the name of that steep hill yonder, with a flattish top, which completely overlooks the camp? I wonder the Dutch have not occupied it. I must say, Sir George's position here wouldn't be tenable if they did. But then, to be sure, they have no cannon. Well, I may as well go with you as you propose, for, of course, if your conjecture is correct, I should not be allowed to leave the English camp." They took up their position accordingly, and presently saw the troops, 700 or 800 in number, move out with a gun which Hardy had seen an hour or two before, the most complete silence being observed. The darkness was already coming on when they set out, and before long it became impossible to distinguish any object except those close at hand. "Sir George must intend a night attack," said Hardy, "but independently of all other considerations, the Boers are less likely to be thrown into confusion by that than our own troops are. They are taught to fight independently of one another. Every man takes up his own position and shifts for himself. If they are disturbed in the middle of the night, they will simply get up, ready dressed, for they always lie down in their clothes, take their rifles, pick out the securest spot they can find, and open fire on any enemy they see. Well, George, we had better stay here a while and see what comes of this. If night fighting is intended, we shall soon know all about it." Rivers assented. They were as conveniently placed as they could well be for learning what was going on. There was a hollow in the rock large enough to shelter them from wind and rain, if either should come on, and a quantity of moss and heather would make a comfortable bed, if they lay down to sleep. They agreed that they would keep alternate watch through the night, so that nothing that might occur should escape their notice. The night, however, passed without disturbance, and when the morning dawned it revealed an unexpected spectacle. The British force was clearly to be discerned by the first beams of the sun, stationed on the top of Amajuba Hill, the ascent of which must have occupied the hours of darkness. It must have been a most difficult and perilous undertaking, and it seemed wonderful that it could have been accomplished in the dark, and without arousing the vigilance of the Boers, who were encamped in the immediate vicinity. There they were, however, the scarlet uniforms forming bright spots against the background of rock and sky, and the brass gun, which by a marvel of engineering skill had been dragged up the precipitous steeps, sparkling in the sun, as it was fixed in its position, commanding the camp of the sleeping Boers below. "How in the world can they have managed that?" exclaimed Rivers. "Nothing but a bird, I should have thought, could get up there. The gun, of course, they must have hoisted up after them. It is a most daring exploit. But I suppose Sir George has got the upper hand of them now." "I'm not so sure of that," rejoined Hardy. "I grant you this is as bold and venturous a feat as ever has been attempted in war. But I don't know that it will succeed against these Boers. You see, though they have taken possession of the heights, they have not entrenched themselves. The broken masses of rock furnish a cover behind which sharpshooters may hide themselves while they fire on the enemy. But the Boers will be able to fire up at them quite as securely as they will be able to fire down at the Boers. And if the Boers, whose numbers greatly exceed theirs, clamber up on all sides under cover of the fire of their friends, there is nothing to keep them back. Our men will be overpowered by weight of numbers. I wish I could see them begin to entrench themselves, but there is no sign of it. I hope we are not going to see the Islandawala disaster acted over again." "I suppose they must have been too tired when they got up there last night to throw up entrenchments," remarked George. "Very likely indeed," returned Hardy. "But they do not appear to be too tired this morning. If they are wise, they will not begin firing until they have made their position safe." Meanwhile, on the summit of the hill there was triumph and rejoicing. These soldiers had felt keenly the defense which they had again and again sustained at the hands of an enemy for whom they had entertained a traditional contempt, and who, they were persuaded, if they could once bring them to a fair encounter, would fly before them. But they had been shot down from behind cover, without the chance being given them of returning their adversaries' fire. But here at last the tables were turned. They occupied now the vantage ground from which the foe might be assailed without the risk of suffering retaliation. A genuine British cheer broke forth as the gun opened on the slumbering Dutchmen below, followed by bursts of merriment as the sleepers started up in alarm and confusion, rushing in all directions to find protection from the deadly hail from above. But they did not take to immediate flight, as their assailants had expected. Niching themselves in the hollows of the rocks or behind the mountain ridges, they opened a fire from all directions on the occupants of the hill, obliging these to keep close behind the cover of the rocks as the only mode of escaping the storm of musketry that continued to be poured upon them. No attempt, however, was made to dislodge them, and it was obvious that, if they retained their position on the crest of the hill, the Boer camp must be broken up, leaving the way open for the British troops to enter the Transvaal. But the English had been once more deceived by the skilful manoeuvring of their enemies. Under cover of a tall cliff which interposed between them and Amajuba Hill, the Boer leaders were determining their plan of operations. "I'm sure one of the paths is practicable," Van der Heyden was saying. "It is on the opposite side to that by which the English made their way to the top, and I think it most likely that they know nothing about it. It is completely sheltered from their fire until you are close to the top, and there is a hollow near that where a number of men may be massed. Our adversaries, with their usual contempt for their enemies, have omitted to entrench themselves or fortify their position. There would probably not be more than half a dozen men keeping guard at that point in question. A rush of a dozen or 20 would force the way in, and then the others would follow. As there is no shelter or means of escape except down the steep sides of the hill, they must all surrender or be killed." "Do you yourself know the way up the path, Van der Heyden?" asked the Boer general. "Yes," answered Hendrik. "I've twice been up to the top that way to make an examination of the English camp." "Then I think you are the man to lead the assault. What say you?" "I desire nothing better," returned Van der Heyden. The dark light, which had become habitual with him at seasons of danger, flashing in his eyes. "Good. Who is there prepared to follow you?" There was no lack of volunteers, and Van der Heyden's only difficulty consisted in his unwillingness to reject any. Presently the number was made up. Orders were given to the sharpshooters in ambush to pour their fire more hotly on every crevice of the rocks below, so as to engage as much as possible the attention of the garrison. Then Van der Heyden, rifle in hand, crept cautiously and silently up the rocky ladder, pausing continually to allow those behind him to approach closely to him, till the hollow place, of which he had spoken was reached, and a dozen of his most trusted followers assembled in it. Then the word was given. The foremost of the party rushed round the corner of the rock, poured in a close fire, and pressed on to force the passage. For the moment they succeeded, but the next a shout was raised, and a bayonet charge met the assailants, bearing them back and almost forcing them down the rocky descent. But more of the Dutchmen had now come on the scene. A second volley cleared the way, and the assailants rushed in ever-increasing numbers. Presently the whole plateau had become a battlefield, and the English, outnumbered and borne back by the overwhelming mass of Boers, were either shot down or made their escape by the steep mountain paths, followed by their victorious enemies, who stabbed and shot them down without mercy. The guns from the camp had not opened their fire and checked the pursuit. It is probable that scarcely any of the British soldiers who had climbed those heights on the previous evening would ever have descended them again, unless as corpses carried to interment. About the center of the plateau a group of Boers were gathered round an English officer who had been struck by a bullet which apparently had instantly killed him. Van der Heyden directed them to take off the leather helmet which partially concealed his features. "It is he," he exclaimed, as his order was obeyed. "That is the English general. That is Sir George Colley." He had scarcely uttered the words when a stray bullet struck him in the breast, and he fell to the ground beside his prostrate enemy. His companions raised him in their arms and earned him down the hill to a room in an adjoining farmhouse, where his wound was examined by a surgeon. The latter shook his head after a brief inspection. The bullet had not touched either head or heart, but the internal hemorrhage could not be stopped, and life could not be long protracted. Van der Heyden himself was unaware of his condition. He made no other request than that a flag of truce might be sent to the English lines, asking permission for the Reverend George Rivers, who was serving, he was informed, as a chaplain in the camp, to visit him on his deathbed. The request was granted, and in an hour's time after the conclusion of the fight, Rivers entered the chamber where he was lying. Van der Heyden raised himself as well as he was able to greet him, and desired that the room might be cleared. "George," he said, when this had been done, "I am glad you have come. There is no time to lose, for I feel that death is very near. You remember our conversation about my sister many months ago near Intumbe." "It is not likely that I should forget it," answered George. "I told you two things. First, that my father had forbidden me to give her in marriage to an Englishman, and secondly, that if she did marry one, she would forfeit the whole of her inheritance." "That is what you said." "And I said no more than the fact. But I thought even then, and I am now more fully persuaded of it, that my father was mistaken in the resolution to which he came. The English had been harsh and unjust to us. But every Englishman is not harsh and unjust, and if my sister has chosen, as in my heart I believe she has, a generous and upright man, it is hard that she should be denied her wish merely because he was an Englishman." He paused a moment to recover breath, and then went on. "Men alter strangely. A 12-month ago I thought it impossible I could ever feel as I do now, and if I had married and had children to follow in my steps, I do not think I could have so altered. But that hope died out and could never be revived, and Anchin's future was all I had to care for. She does not know my change of feeling. When I took leave of her last night, I felt assured that I was parting from her for the last time, although I could not tell her so. But this letter will convey to her my dying wishes. I have drawn up a fresh will, by which everything is left to her and to you. Give me your hand." They exchanged a cordial grasp. "Now, Rivers," he continued, "we will speak no more of this, but you must remain with me to the end." There is no need to dwell on what followed. Van der Heyden lingered for an hour, and then passed away quietly, without pain, remaining conscious to the last. When all was over, George gave the order, as his friend had desired him to do, for the conveyance of the body to the burying-ground at Utrecht, where the remains of the hapless Lisa van Cortlandt had been deposited. He himself accompanied the corpse as chief mourner, and saw the funeral rites performed. Then he proceeded to Newcastle, and sought an interview with Anchin, with whom his mother and Thaisra were now staying. They had gone over, by his request, to convey to her the melancholy tidings, and had remained at her earnest entreaty to comfort her. She did indeed feel unutterably desolate. Her brother and Frank Moritz had been her only near relatives, and of both these she had been bereaved. And the man who, she felt, might have been nearer and dearer than any, was hopelessly separated from her by Henrik's decree. His wishes had always been law to her while he lived, and now that he had been taken from her forever, her only satisfaction in life would be to fulfill his pleasure. When the message was brought to her that George desired an interview, she was at first unwilling to grant it. It was possible that he might renew his suit, considering all obstacles to their union as being now removed, and if so, their meeting would be needlessly painful. It was only when Thyra told her that her brother was the bearer of a letter which Henrik had sent her from his dying bed that she consented to receive him. She was sitting near the window when he entered. Her black dress rendered the dazzling fairness of her complexion more remarkable. Even the look of unutterable sadness seemed to enhance her beauty. He went slowly up to her, took her hand and pressed it to his lips, and then, without speaking, placed the letter in her hands. Her tears fell fast over it as she opened it, and it seemed as if they must have prevented her from deciphering its contents, for she twice read it through without appearing to understand its purport. At last a faint flush on her cheek and a strange light in her eye told him that she had realized the meaning of her brother's words. She sat for a few minutes with her eyes fixed on the ground, and then looked up into her lover's face, as if seeking there a confirmation of the wondrous joy that had broken thus suddenly upon her. His smile seemed to satisfy her. She rose and threw herself into his arms. "Oh, George," she exclaimed, "is it wicked, at a time of sorrow like this, to feel so happy?" "It is what he wished," answered Rivers. It was the thought which comforted him at the last. A few days afterwards, Anchen joined the family circle at Dijksman Hallam, when it was found that she was not the only bride to whom congratulations were due. George had taken an early opportunity of explaining to his mother and stepfather, to whom the former referred him, the change that had taken place in his circumstances. He was now, or would shortly be, the owner of Petersdorf and Vander Heiden's other property, and for a resident in that country, a very wealthy man. It was his wish to surrender all interest in his mother's estate in favor of Thyra. At the same time he pleaded the cause of his friend, Reggie Margetts. He had known, he said, for some time past that he was deeply attached to Thyra, and had reason to believe that she was not indifferent to him. If that should prove to be the case, might not a second marriage take place? Mr. Rogers had been consulted, and had declared himself so well satisfied with Margetts that he was willing to put him into the farm hitherto occupied by George, which was already in a thriving state, with every prospect of improvement. Here he and Thyra might live until the time came when Umtongo would be their own. Farmer Manson heard his stepson to the end. He had never, indeed, been known to interrupt anyone, and then answered that he and his wife had already spoken together on this subject, and had no fault to find with Mr. Margetts. But it would be impossible for them to accept him as a suitor for Thyra, because Mynheer Rudolf Kranzberg had been received in that capacity, and no decisive answer had as yet been given him. To this George replied that he had had some conversation with Thyra on the subject, and she had informed him that young Kranzberg had never visited her since the day when he himself had left Umtongo, and as that was fully 9 months ago, Thyra had concluded he had abandoned all idea of seeking her as his wife. "She is too hasty," remarked Ludwig. 9 months are no unreasonable time for a Dutch suitor to delay. We do not do things in this country in a hurry. She cannot allow the addresses of a new suitor until the old one has been formally dismissed. "But, good gracious, how long is that to go on?" pleaded George. "He may pay another visit 6 months hence, and another a 12-month after that, and Thyra may be an old maid before she has the opportunity of relieving herself from the attentions of her admirer by refusing him." "You do not understand our customs," said Ludwig sedately. "We do everything deliberately." This reply George was obliged to transmit to Margetts, by whom, it needs not to say, it was not received with much satisfaction. Reggie, in fact, propounded a variety of schemes for bringing Rudolf von Kranzberg up to the scratch, the mildest of which was lassoing him after the fashion of the South American hunters, and conveying him in that condition to Thyra's presence, when she would avail herself of the opportunity of giving her inamorato his conge. All these were rejected by George and Thyra, and the dissatisfaction of the baffled suitor every day waxed more grievous to behold. When one day he chanced to encounter Hardy in the street at Newcastle, and learned from him that Rudolf Kranzberg was not only paying his addresses to Gretchen Grotweld, the plump and comely daughter of the Landrost of Lichtenberg, but it was generally believed had been accepted by her. "I met him riding down the street," said Hardy, "dressed in his best holiday suit, and a large nosegay in his buttonhole. He was mounted on a showy horse, the courting horse, as they call it, which he made amble and prance down the street to the great admiration of the spectators. Presently he drew up at Mynheer Grotwell's door, when the worthy Burgess greeted him with ceremonious politeness, and requested him to enter. I heard from the Landrost, who delayed a few minutes to speak to me, that Mistress Gretchen is well satisfied with her sweetheart, and the formal betrothal is straightway to take place." This intelligence was presently confirmed by Mynheer Grotweld himself, overcame even Ludwig Manson's punctilio, and Reginald Margetts and Thyra were allowed to plight their troth to one another. Mr. Rogers, who always felt a warm interest in the Mansons, and who latterly conceived a still warmer regard for Rivers and Margetts, was much pleased at the course which events had taken. Notwithstanding the recent death of Henrik van der Heyden, it was not thought advisable to postpone for more than a few weeks Rivers and Unchen's wedding, and the Mansons agreed that Reggie and Thyra should be married on the same day, the chapel attached to Mr. Rogers' house being chosen as the place where both ceremonies were to be performed. The guests were limited to the near relatives of the brides, the only exception being Hardy, who arrived on the wedding morning, bearing the intelligence that the terms between the English government and the Boers had been finally arranged. The suzerainty of the Queen was to be maintained, but apart from this, the most complete independence was conceded to the Transvaal Republic, all the terms for which they had stipulated being fully granted. "Well," said Mr. Rogers, "I never thought I should live to regret the reversal of that most mischievous and ill-judged of measures, the annexation of the Transvaal, but I have lived to regret it nevertheless. It appears to me that every blunder that was possible has been made. First of all, advantage is taken of a temporary reverse to impose on a nation a yoke which they are supposed to desire, but which they really dislike. Then, when reasonable and respectful petitions are presented, pointing out that the step is to the injury of both countries, and praying that it might be undone, they are curtly refused. Then, when the aggrieved citizens take up arms to compel the recognition of their rights, an attempt is made to crush them by force of arms. But the campaign is conducted in such a manner as to give them an easy and certain victory. I don't suppose the 10th Legion of Caesar, or the Old Guard of Napoleon, or Wellington's Peninsular veterans could have done anything but stand to be killed, if they had been led into action as our soldiers were. And lastly, when the prestige of England has suffered so seriously that a victory, which could easily have been gained, has become imperatively necessary for its restoration, all that has been refused to moderate entreaty is granted to defy an almost insolent demand. I don't suppose the injury that has been done to British ascendancy in South Africa will be undone in less than 50 years, if it is undone then. Well, things are at their worst now, and when they have come to the worst, then the proverb says that they will begin to mend. That must be our comfort, for I am afraid we have no other." The end. End of chapter 24. End of Perils in the Transvaal and Zululand by H.C. Adams.